Good evening and welcome. You have found Sleep Tales, a quiet place for stories to help you find your rest. Tonight's story is a special one, a journey of remembrance and discovery. If you enjoy our time together, please consider subscribing to the channel. A small like helps others find this quiet corner too. I always love to see where the stories travel, so feel free to leave a comment and let me know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Now, find a comfortable position, settle into your bed, and let the day fade away. Close your eyes. We are about to begin our story. Our story is about a young woman named Phoebe. She was 22 years old and worked as a technician at the Oak Creek Animal Shelter. It was a place filled with loud noises and quiet hopes. Phoebe herself was a quiet person, an observer who often felt invisible in her own life. She poured all the feelings she could not speak into the gentle care of the animals, especially the ones who were forgotten. Her most special friend was Gus, an old dog with one cloudy eye and a calm, steady heart. He had lived at the shelter for many years, watching puppies and younger dogs find homes while he remained behind. To Phoebe, Gus was more than just another animal in a cage. He was a silent companion, a friend who seemed to understand what it was like to be left behind. Their friendship was built in the quiet moments between the noise, in the gentle rhythm of her hand stroking his gray fur, and in the patient way he always waited for her to appear at the door of his kennel at the end of a long day. Chapter 1. The Stillness of Morning. The shelter woke up the same way every morning. First came the light, pale and gray through the high barred windows. Then came the sounds. A single bark, then another, then a chorus of yaps and whines and deep-throated calls that echoed off the concrete floors and cinder block walls. The building was a great container of wanting breakfast, wanting a walk, wanting a home. After the sounds came the smells, the sharp, clean scent of bleach from the nightly cleaning mixed with the warm, dusty smell of animal fur and the earthy scent of dry kibble. Phoebe knew this world by heart. She could walk through it with her eyes closed and know exactly which kennel held the nervous little terrier and which one held the big, sad-eyed hound. Her own life felt gray and quiet, like the morning light. But here, she had a purpose. Her purpose had soft fur and trusting eyes. Her purpose was to bring a little comfort into this loud, wanting place. She moved through the morning routine with a quiet efficiency. She filled water bowls. She measured out food. She spoke in a low, calm voice to the dogs who were scared and offered a gentle touch to the ones who were lonely. But her path always ended in the same place. It ended at the last kennel in the quietest row, the one reserved for the senior dogs. It ended with Gus. This morning, she carried a special gift for him. It was a soft blue blanket, one she had found at a second-hand store. It was worn thin in places, and the color had faded, but it was incredibly soft. She knew Gus's old bones ached on the hard concrete floor, and she hoped this would help. She opened the latch to his kennel. It made a familiar metallic click. Gus was lying in his usual spot, curled into a tight circle. He did not lift his head, which was unusual. He always lifted his head. Phoebe knelt down on the cool floor. "Gus," she said softly, "I brought you something." The silence in the kennel was different from their usual shared quiet. It was a deep, heavy stillness. She reached out and touched his back. There was no warmth, There was no gentle rise and fall of his breathing. There was only stillness. Gus was gone. The world outside the kennel seemed to rush away from her. The chorus of barking became a distant hum, a sound from another world. The sharp smell of bleach faded. All she could feel was the cold, hard concrete beneath her knees and the profound emptiness in the small space in front of her. He had died alone, in a cage. The thought was a sharp, painful stone in her chest. She had failed him. All her quiet talks, all her gentle pats, all the soft blankets in the world had not changed the simple, hard fact of where his life had ended. Phoebe stayed there for a long time, kneeling in front of the open kennel. The blue blanket was still folded neatly in her hands. Other workers walked by. They saw her and understood. They gave her space. Loss was a part of life at the shelter, a shadow that walked alongside the hope. Eventually, Maria, the shelter manager, came and stood beside her. Maria was a practical woman with kind, tired eyes. She had seen this kind of grief many times. She placed a firm hand on Phoebe's shoulder. "He was old, Phoebe," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "He had a peaceful end. That is more than many get." Phoebe nodded, but she could not speak. A peaceful end was not a happy end. It was not a home. It was not a family. It was just an end. Later, Maria told her to gather his things. There was not much. A worn rubber ball that had lost its squeak years ago. A stainless steel food bowl dented on one side. And his collar. It was an old leather collar, cracked and faded from years of wear. The buckle was tarnished and green in places. It was the only thing he had arrived with, a small piece of a life that came before the shelter. Phoebe held it in her hands. It felt small and insignificant. She ran her thumb over the worn leather, thinking of the neck it had circled for so many years. She was about to put it in the small cardboard box with his other things when her fingers felt something odd. There was a small, hard lump inside the lining of the collar. It was not a buckle. It was not a stud. It was something hidden, sewn between the layers of leather. Her curiosity pushed through the fog of her sadness. She took the collar to the small office at the front of the shelter. She found a pair of small, sharp scissors used for cutting open bags of pet food. With careful fingers, she made a tiny snip in the stitching of the collar's lining. She pulled the threads apart and peered inside. A small piece of metal glinted in the dim light. She tilted the collar, and a tiny, tarnished metal tag fell into the palm of her hand. It was not a name tag. It was not a license. It was a small, rectangular piece of metal with words stamped into it. Phoebe had to hold it up to the light of the window to read them. The letters were small and worn, but she could make them out. There were 3 lines. The first was a number, 1. The second was 2 words, Lighthouse Road. The third was 2 more words, Port Blossom. 1 Lighthouse Road, Port Blossom. It was an address, a place, a beginning. Gus had a beginning. He was not just a shelter dog who had ended here. He was a dog from somewhere. He had belonged to a place. The knowledge was a tiny spark in the deep well of her sadness. She closed her hand around the small metal tag, the cool edges pressing into her skin. The little piece of metal felt heavy, full of a story she did not know. It was a secret he had carried with him all this time, a silent piece of his past. The shelter, with its loud noises and endless needs, felt different now. It felt like a middle place, a long pause in a story, but not the whole thing. And Phoebe knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she could not let his story end here, in a small cardboard box in a back room. She had to find the beginning. She had to take him home. The next days were a blur for Phoebe. The grief for Gus remained a constant, dull ache in her chest, a quiet companion to her every move. She performed her duties at the shelter mechanically. She filled the bowls, cleaned the kennels, and walked the dogs. But her mind was somewhere else. It was on a road she had never seen, heading toward a town she had never heard of, toward a lighthouse that existed only in her imagination. The small metal tag lived in her pocket. She would take it out and trace the letters with her finger when no one was looking. One Lighthouse Road, Port Blossom. The words became a chant in her mind, a promise she had made to a friend who could no longer hear her. She spent her evenings in the local library, using their old, slow computer to look up Port Blossom. It was a small dot on a map of the coast, hundreds of miles away. Pictures showed a rugged shoreline, gray waves crashing against dark rocks, and a cluster of small, weathered buildings. It looked like a place at the edge of the world. The journey seemed impossible. She had an old car that made strange noises when it went uphill. She had very little money saved, just enough to cover her rent and food, with a tiny bit left over. Taking a week off from work was a luxury she could not afford. And yet, the idea would not leave her. It was more than an idea. It was a need. It felt like the only meaningful thing she could do. Every time she walked past Gus's empty kennel, the need grew stronger. The silence from that space was a constant reminder of her promise. She imagined his ashes sitting in a plain wooden box on a dusty shelf in the shelter's storage room, forgotten. It felt wrong. It felt like the final page of his story had been torn out. She had to write it for him. The thought of Maria's reaction made her nervous. Maria was kind, but she was also a realist. She dealt in budgets and adoption statistics and the hard truth that there were always more animals than there were homes. A long, expensive trip for a dog that was already gone would sound like foolish sentimentality to her. Phoebe practiced the conversation in her head. She tried to find the right words to explain the feeling in her gut, the deep conviction that this was something she had to do. Finally, she gathered her courage. She found Maria in the small, cluttered office, hunched over a pile of paperwork. The room smelled of coffee and stress. "Maria," Phoebe began, her voice barely a whisper. Maria looked up, her pen hovering over a form. "I need to ask for some time off. A week." Maria raised an eyebrow. "A vacation? That's not like you, Phoebe. Is everything all right?" Phoebe took a deep breath. She pulled the small metal tag from her pocket and placed it on the desk between them. "I found this in Gus's collar," she explained. "It's an address. I think it was his home." Maria picked up the tag and squinted at it. She read the words aloud. "1 Lighthouse Road, Port Blossom." She looked back at Phoebe, her expression unreadable. "What are you thinking of doing with this?" "I want to take him there," Phoebe said, her voice growing a little stronger. "His ashes. I want to take him home." Maria was silent for a long moment. She put the tag down and leaned back in her chair, the old springs groaning in protest. "Phoebe," she said, and her voice was filled with a weary kindness that was worse than any anger. "That's a sweet thought. A very sweet thought. But you need to be practical. That town is a 2-day drive, maybe 3 in your car. Gas costs money. Food costs money. You would be taking a week off without pay. All for what? For a memory. For a feeling." Phoebe felt her resolve start to waver. Everything Maria said was true. It was not practical. It was not logical. It was a decision made by a grieving heart. "He deserves it," Phoebe said quietly. "His life mattered. It should have a proper ending." "His life did matter," Maria agreed, leaning forward again. "It mattered to you. You gave him a wonderful gift in his last years. You gave him your friendship. You gave him a comfortable, peaceful end. That is a huge thing. You do not need to do this to prove anything." But it was not about proving anything. It was about finishing something. It was about honoring a story that no one else knew existed. "I have to do this, Maria," Phoebe said, her voice firm now. "For him and for me." Maria looked at her for a long time, studying her face. She saw the deep sadness in Phoebe's eyes, but she also saw a flicker of something else, something she had not seen there before. A spark of determination, a quiet strength. She sighed, a long, slow breath. "I cannot approve paid time off for this," she said finally, "but I will not stop you from taking the week. Your job will be here when you get back." A wave of relief washed over Phoebe, so powerful it almost made her dizzy. "Thank you," she said. Maria just nodded and turned back to her paperwork. The conversation was over. The decision was made. Phoebe was going to Port Blossom. Chapter 2: A Promise in the Silence. The conversation with Maria did not end the turmoil inside Phoebe. It only gave it a direction. The permission, reluctant as it was, felt like a key turning in a lock. A door had opened, and on the other side was a long, uncertain road. The days that followed were strange. Phoebe went to work at the shelter. She did her job with the same quiet care she always had. She filled the water bowls until they were perfectly full, the clear water shimmering under the fluorescent lights. She measured the food with precision, making sure each animal got exactly what it needed. She mopped the floors until they shone, the smell of clean bleach temporarily overpowering the constant scent of dog and cat. But while her hands were busy, her mind was far away. It was tracing a line on a map she had not yet bought. It was picturing a coastline she had only seen in grainy photos on a library computer. Her thoughts were filled with the sound of waves, the smell of salt, and the image of a tall white lighthouse standing against a gray sky. The shelter, once the center of her small world, now felt like a waiting room. It was a place she had to pass through on her way to somewhere else. The other workers noticed a change in her. She was even quieter than usual. Her smiles were small and distant. They assumed she was still grieving for Gus, and in a way, they were right. But her grief was no longer a heavy, shapeless cloud. It now had a purpose. It was fuel for a journey. The most difficult part of each day was walking past Gus's old kennel. A new dog was in it now, a young, nervous beagle mix with eyes that were constantly darting around, afraid of the noise. Phoebe was kind to the new dog. She spoke to it in a low, soothing voice and made sure it had a soft bed. But she could not look at the kennel without seeing Gus. She saw him lying in his favorite corner, his one good eye watching her with a calm, steady gaze. She saw him thumping his tail gently against the concrete floor when she brought him his food. The kennel was no longer just a space. It was a container of memories, and its emptiness, even when filled by another, echoed with her loss. Her small apartment felt different, too. It had always been a quiet refuge from the noise of the shelter, but now the silence felt heavier. It was a listening silence, as if the rooms were waiting for her to make a decision, to finally act on the promise she had made to herself. She would sit on her simple couch in the evenings, the small metal tag from Gus's collar on the table in front of her. She would pick it up and feel its weight in her palm. It was such a small thing, but it held the power to change everything. It was a link to a past she knew nothing about, and a guide to a future she could not yet imagine. The first practical step was the hardest. She had to claim Gus's ashes. The shelter used a local veterinary service for cremations. Phoebe had to make the call herself. Her hand trembled as she dialed the number. The voice on the other end of the line was professional and polite. Yes, they had the records. Yes, the service was complete. She could come and pick up the remains anytime. The simple clinical words felt jarring. They reduced her profound loss to a transaction, a task to be completed. She thanked the person on the phone and hung up, her heart beating fast. This made it real. The next day, during her lunch break, she drove to the veterinary clinic. It was a clean, bright building that smelled of antiseptic and animal fear. She stood at the front desk, feeling small and out of place. She gave her name and Gus's name. The receptionist, a young woman with a kind face, gave her a sympathetic smile and disappeared into a back room. Phoebe waited, her hands clenched into fists in her pockets. She stared at a poster on the wall about pet dental health, reading the words without understanding them. The receptionist returned carrying a small, plain wooden box. It was the color of light honey, and the wood was smooth and simple. There was a small brass plaque on the front. It just said, Gus. The woman placed the box gently on the counter between them. Phoebe looked at it. It seemed impossible that her friend, his quiet strength, his gentle presence, could be contained in something so small. She reached out and touched the wood. It was cool and smooth. She had expected it to feel different, to hold some kind of energy or warmth, but it was just a box. It was a beautiful box, but it was just a box. She paid the fee, her movements stiff and automatic. The receptionist put the box in a simple paper bag. Phoebe took it. The bag was heavier than she expected. She carried it out of the clinic and back to her car, holding it carefully with both hands, as if it were fragile. She placed the bag on the passenger seat, right where Gus used to sit on the rare occasions she had taken him for a drive. The seat suddenly felt huge and empty. She sat in the driver's seat for a long time, just looking at the bag. The journey was no longer an idea. It was a reality, sitting on the seat beside her. She was no longer just thinking about taking Gus home. She was taking him home. The weight of that responsibility settled over her, but it was not an unpleasant weight. It felt right. It felt like she was finally doing something that mattered. That evening, Phoebe began her real preparations. She took the wooden box out of the paper bag and placed it in the center of her small kitchen table. It looked dignified and important there. It was the anchor around which everything else would now revolve. First, she looked at her finances. She went to the bank and took out most of the money she had saved. It was not very much. She counted the bills carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. She divided the money into small piles, one for gasoline, one for food, one for a cheap motel room if she needed it. One small pile was for emergencies. She put each pile into a separate envelope and wrote its purpose on the front in her neat, careful handwriting. Seeing the small amount of money laid out on the table was scary. Maria's practical warnings echoed in her mind. This was a foolish risk. But when she looked at the wooden box, the fear lessened. This was not a vacation. It was a duty. Next, she made a list. She was a person who liked lists. They brought order to a world that often felt chaotic. She wrote down everything she would need: clothes, a toothbrush, soap, a map, water, food that would not spoil, a blanket and a pillow for the car, a flashlight. She read the list over and over, trying to think of anything she might have forgotten. The world outside her small apartment felt vast and unpredictable. She wanted to be prepared. The next day, she went to the store. She moved through the aisles with a focused intensity. She chose her items with care, looking for the best value, trying to make her small amount of money stretch as far as it could. She bought a large, detailed road map and spread it out on the floor of her apartment. She found Port Blossom, a tiny speck on the edge of the vast blue ocean. She traced the route from her town to the coast with her finger. The line was long. It crossed through landscapes she had never seen, through towns with unfamiliar names. The map made the distance feel real and enormous. It was one thing to see it on a computer screen, but it was another to feel the crisp paper under her fingers and see the sheer scale of the journey she was about to undertake. She bought simple food: loaves of bread, jars of peanut butter, apples, and bags of nuts. Food that would give her energy and not require a stove. She bought a case of bottled water and loaded it into the trunk of her car. She thought about what clothes to bring. Her wardrobe was small and simple, mostly jeans and plain t-shirts, the practical uniform of her life. She chose 2 pairs of jeans, a few shirts, a warm sweater, and a rain jacket. She folded each item neatly and placed it in a small duffel bag. It did not take long to pack. Her whole life, it seemed, could fit into a single bag. She spent the last afternoon preparing her car. It was an old sedan, faded and dented, but it was hers. She trusted it, mostly. She checked the oil. She filled the tires with air. She washed the windows until they were clear and clean. She cleaned out the inside, throwing away old receipts and empty water bottles. She wanted to start the journey with a clean space, a fresh beginning. The car was old, but it was ready. She placed her duffel bag and the pillow and blanket on the back seat. She put the envelope with the gasoline money in the glove compartment. Then, she picked up the wooden box from her kitchen table. She held it for a moment, her thumb stroking the smooth wood. This was the most important part of the journey. She opened the passenger door of her car and placed the box gently on the seat. It looked small against the worn fabric. She found the seat belt and clicked it into place, securing the box so it would not slide around. It was a silly gesture, she knew, but it felt right. Gus was her passenger. He was her co-pilot. He was with her. Her last night in the apartment was quiet and strange. She made a simple dinner and ate it at her table, across from the empty space where the box had been. The apartment felt hollow now, stripped of its purpose. She washed her dishes and put them away. She looked around at her few belongings, a small collection of books, a single framed photograph of her parents, a potted plant on the windowsill. It was not much, but it was her life. And she was about to leave it all behind, even if it was just for a week. She knew that when she came back, something would be different. She would be different. Sleep did not come easily that night. She lay in her bed, listening to the sounds of the building, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards in the apartment above. She thought about the miles ahead of her. She thought about the strangers she might meet. She thought about the old man who might be waiting at the lighthouse, the man who had lost his dog so many years ago. What would she say to him? How could she explain this strange pilgrimage she had undertaken? She was filled with a mix of fear and excitement. She was afraid of the unknown, of her car breaking down, of running out of money, of the whole trip being a terrible mistake. But she was also filled with a quiet sense of rightness, a deep feeling that she was on the correct path. It was a feeling she had not had in a very long time. Phoebe did not need an alarm clock. She woke up while the sky was still a deep, dark purple before the first hint of morning. A profound stillness lay over the city. She got out of bed and dressed in the dark. She moved through her apartment with a quiet grace, her actions deliberate and sure. She made a thermos of hot coffee. She ate a final piece of toast standing in her kitchen. She took the potted plant from her windowsill and placed it in the sink, giving it a long drink of water. She wrote a small note for her neighbor, asking her to collect her mail. She did one last check of the apartment, her eyes scanning each room. Everything was in its place. She picked up her keys and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the doorknob, taking one last look at her small, quiet life. Then she opened the door, stepped outside, and locked it behind her. The sound of the lock clicking into place was loud in the silent hallway. It felt final. The drive through her own town was like moving through a dream. The streets were empty. The traffic lights blinked yellow into the darkness. The houses were all dark, their occupants still asleep. She felt like the only person awake in the entire world. She drove past the familiar landmarks, the grocery store, the park, the library. They all looked different in the pre-dawn light, like parts of a life that already belonged to her past. Her route took her past the Oak Creek Animal Shelter. She slowed the car as she approached. The building was dark and silent. It was hard to believe that in just a few hours, it would be filled with its usual chorus of barks and meows. It looked peaceful in the darkness. She thought of all the animals sleeping inside, each one waiting for a story to begin. Her story, she realized, was finally beginning now. She drove on, leaving the shelter and the town behind her. She found the entrance to the highway, a wide, dark ribbon of asphalt stretching out into the darkness. She guided her small car up the ramp and merged into the empty lanes. She pressed her foot on the gas pedal and the car picked up speed. The engine hummed a steady, familiar tune. To her right, on the passenger seat, the simple wooden box sat securely, held in place by the seat belt. Ahead of her, the first faint line of gray was appearing on the horizon. A new day was beginning. A long road was waiting. Phoebe gripped the steering wheel, her eyes fixed on the unfolding dawn. She was on her way. Chapter 3: The Kindness of Strangers. The first hours on the highway were a blur of gray asphalt and white lines. Phoebe drove with a quiet focus, her hands holding the steering wheel at the top, just as she had been taught in her driving class years ago. The world outside her windows was a moving painting. The deep purple of the pre-dawn sky slowly gave way to a soft, bruised gray. Then a thin line of pale orange appeared on the horizon, widening and brightening with a slow, steady confidence. The sun rose, and the world was filled with a clean, new light. The fields on either side of the road were covered in a low, white mist, making them look like soft, sleeping oceans. Tall trees stood like dark, silent guards, watching her pass. The highway was mostly empty. Occasionally, a large truck would roar past her, its size making her small car shudder in its wake. The drivers were invisible, hidden high up in their cabins. For the most part, she was alone. The car was its own tiny world, humming with the steady sound of the engine and the rush of the wind. Inside this world, there were only two travelers, Phoebe and the quiet wooden box on the seat beside her. The initial feeling of purpose, the one that had propelled her out of bed and onto the road, began to fade with the rising sun. In its place, a deep and profound loneliness settled in. It was a familiar feeling for Phoebe, a quiet companion she had known for most of her life. But out here, on this endless road, the loneliness felt bigger. It was as vast as the sky above her and as empty as the fields stretching out on either side. She looked over at the wooden box. In the daylight, she could see the grain of the wood, the small, perfect lines and swirls that made it unique. She reached out and placed her hand on its smooth surface. It was cool to the touch. It did not offer any comfort, not really. It was just a box. But it was also a reason. It was the only reason she was here, moving through this strange, new landscape. Her mind began to drift, pulling her back into the quiet hallways of her own past. The constant motion of the car, the endless repetition of the white lines on the road seemed to unlock doors in her memory that had been closed for a long time. She remembered being a little girl, standing at the edge of the school playground. The other children were a whirlwind of bright colors and loud noises. They ran and shouted, playing games with complicated rules she never seemed to understand. She was not a part of their world. She was an observer, standing perfectly still, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. She remembered focusing on the small things. A line of ants marching purposefully across a crack in the pavement. A single red leaf that had fallen from a tree and landed on the dark, damp wood chips. A small, gray feather, soft and perfect, lying in the grass. These were her friends. They were quiet, like her. They did not demand anything from her. She could watch them for hours, making up stories about their small, important lives. She felt a connection to them, a sense of shared quietness in a loud world. She saw herself in their smallness, in their overlooked beauty. This was where her love for the forgotten things had begun. It had started on that playground, with the ants and the leaf and the feather. She looked at the wooden box again. Gus had been like that. He was a quiet, overlooked thing of beauty. While other people saw an old, one-eyed dog, she had seen a steady, gentle soul. She had seen a friend. The highway continued to unspool before her. The sun climbed higher in the sky, burning off the morning mist. The landscape began to change. The flat fields gave way to low, rolling hills covered in a blanket of green trees. The road began to curve, rising and falling with the shape of the land. She passed small towns that were just a cluster of buildings and a single blinking traffic light. She saw them from a distance, a brief interruption in the endless green. She did not feel any desire to stop. They were other people's homes, other people's lives. They had nothing to do with her. Her journey was about something else. Another memory surfaced, clearer this time. It was of her family's cat, a very old, very quiet creature named Jasper. He was a ginger cat with fur that had grown thin and patchy with age. The rest of her family rarely paid him any mind. He was just a piece of the furniture, a silent presence in the corner of a room. But Phoebe had loved him. She remembered sitting on the floor with him for hours, her small hand gently stroking his back. She could feel every bone in his thin body. His purr was not the loud rumble of a young, healthy cat. It was a faint, rattling sound, like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. She would press her ear to his side to hear it. She would bring him his food, mashing it with a fork to make it easier for him to eat. She would make sure his water bowl was always clean and full. When he grew too old to climb onto his favorite chair, she would lift him up herself, his body light and fragile in her arms. She had been his caretaker, his quiet guardian. The day he died, no one else in the house seemed to notice for a while. It was Phoebe who found him, curled up in his favorite patch of sunlight, finally still. She had felt a grief so large it seemed to fill the entire house, but she had held it inside. It was a private sadness, a quiet pact between her and the old cat. It was her first real understanding of loss, and her first real understanding of the deep, silent bonds that could form with a creature that did not speak. Driving now, with Gus's ashes beside her, she felt that same private sadness. This journey was a secret she held, a quiet promise between her and her old friend. No one else in the world needed to understand it. Only she did. The miles rolled by. The sun reached its highest point in the sky, beating down on the roof of her car. The air inside grew warm and stale. She rolled down the window, and the wind rushed in, loud and warm, whipping her hair around her face. It smelled of hot asphalt and dust and distant green things. She ate an apple as she drove, the crisp, sweet taste a welcome change from the stale air in the car. She drank from a bottle of water, the lukewarm liquid doing little to quench her thirst. The initial strangeness of the journey had worn off, replaced by a dull, hypnotic rhythm. The hum of the engine, the blur of the scenery, the endless road. She felt like she could drive forever, that the highway had no beginning and no end. She was just a small, moving part of its endless flow. Then she heard it. It was a small sound at first, a faint tapping noise that seemed to come from deep within the engine. It was easy to ignore. She turned up the radio, hoping to drown it out. The radio could only find a single station, a crackling broadcast of a man talking about the price of corn. She turned it off. The tapping was still there. It was a little louder now, a little more insistent. It was a nervous sound, a little metal heart beating too fast. Phoebe gripped the steering wheel tighter. A cold knot of fear began to form in her stomach. Please, she thought, not now, not here. She was in the middle of nowhere. The rolling hills had flattened out again into vast, empty plains. There were no towns in sight. There were no other cars. There was just the road, the sky, and the endless, silent land. The tapping sound changed. It became a whine, a high, thin sound of protest. The car began to feel different. It felt tired. The steady power she was used to began to falter. She pressed her foot down on the gas pedal, but the car did not respond. It began to slow down, losing its momentum. The whining sound grew louder, more desperate. Then it was joined by a shudder. The whole car shook, a violent, rattling vibration that made her teeth clatter. She knew what was happening. Her old, tired car was giving up. She steered it toward the side of the road, her movements clumsy with panic. The car rolled to a stop on the gravel shoulder. The engine gave one last, final cough, a puff of gray smoke from under the hood, and then it died. The silence that followed was shocking. After hours of constant noise, the sudden, total absence of sound was deafening. There was no hum of the engine, no rush of the wind. There was only the sound of her own ragged breathing and the frantic, panicked beating of her heart. She sat perfectly still for a long minute, her hands frozen on the steering wheel. She stared out the windshield at the empty road ahead. This cannot be happening, she thought. It was a mistake. She would turn the key and the engine would start again. She reached out a trembling hand and turned the key in the ignition. The only sound was a sad, defeated click. She tried again, click, and again, click. It was no use. The car was dead. The cold knot of fear in her stomach exploded, spreading through her whole body. Panic, cold and sharp, washed over her. She was stranded. She was alone, in the middle of an empty landscape, with a broken car and a very small amount of money. Maria's words came back to her, clear and sharp in the sudden silence. Be practical, Phoebe. She had not been practical. She had been foolish. She had followed a feeling, a sentimental whim, and it had led her here, to this empty road, to this complete and utter failure. She felt a wave of shame so powerful it made her feel sick, What was she thinking? A journey across the country for a dead dog? It was insane. It was a child's fantasy. She was a stupid, foolish girl who had made a stupid, foolish mistake. She dropped her forehead against the steering wheel, the hard plastic cool against her hot skin. Tears of frustration and fear welled up in her eyes and rolled down her cheeks. She had failed. She had failed Gus. She would never get him home now. She would have to call for a tow truck, spend all of her carefully saved money, and then limp back home in disgrace. The whole journey was over before it had even really begun. After a long time, her tears subsided, leaving behind a hollow, empty feeling. Crying would not fix the car. Crying would not get her off this empty road. She had to do something. She took a deep, shaky breath and lifted her head. She looked around. The world outside her car was still and silent. The sun was hot and bright. There was nothing to do but wait. Wait for another car to come by, or walk. She looked at the road stretching out in front of her. It disappeared into the heat haze in the distance. She had no idea how far it was to the next town. It could be 1 mile. It could be 20. She looked at the wooden box on the seat beside her. Its simple, steady presence seemed to mock her panic. It was just a box. It did not care that they were stranded. It was just waiting. Phoebe made a decision. She could not just sit here, waiting for a rescue that might never come. She had to move. She had to do something. She opened the car door. The heat of the day hit her like a physical blow. She got out and locked the car, a pointless gesture in this vast emptiness. She took her bottle of water and her small purse with the envelopes of money. She looked down the road in one direction, then the other. It was a 50-50 chance. She chose the direction she had been heading and started to walk. The gravel on the shoulder of the road crunched under her shoes. The sun beat down on her head and shoulders. The air was thick and heavy. Every breath was hot and dusty. There was no shade. The world was just a wide, open expanse of brown grass and blue sky. She walked for what felt like a very long time. Her legs began to ache. Her throat felt dry, even though she took small sips of her warm water. The silence was absolute. There were no birds, no insects. Just the sound of her own footsteps on the gravel. She started to feel small and insignificant, a tiny, lost speck in a huge, indifferent world. Just when she was starting to think she had made the wrong choice, that she should turn back, she saw something in the distance. It was a dark shape shimmering in the heat. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, but as she got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a sign, a faded, peeling sign on the side of the road. It was too far away to read, but it was a sign of human life. Hope, small and fragile, flickered within her. She walked faster, her tired legs finding a new energy. She reached the sign. The paint was cracked and faded, but she could still make out the words. Welcome to Harmony Creek, population 127. Below the words was a faded picture of a smiling cartoon farmer, Harmony Creek. The name was not on her map. It was one of those small, forgotten places that existed between the lines. She looked past the sign and saw the town. It was not much. A handful of small wooden buildings clustered together on either side of the road. A water tower stood tall and rusted against the blue sky. It looked sleepy and forgotten, like a place that time had passed by. But it was a town. It had people. And it might have a mechanic. Phoebe walked into Harmony Creek. The main street was wide and empty. A few old pickup trucks were parked in front of the buildings. The buildings themselves looked tired. The paint was peeling and the wooden porches sagged. A dog lay sleeping in a patch of shade on the sidewalk. It lifted its head as she passed, gave her a lazy look, and then went back to sleep. The town was silent. It felt like she had stepped into a photograph from a long time ago. She walked past a small grocery store with a dusty window display. She passed a post office with a faded American flag hanging limply from a pole. And then she saw it. A low cinder block building with two large garage doors. A sign hung crookedly above the doors. It said, "Ben's Garage. We fix anything." Relief washed over Phoebe, so strong it made her knees feel weak. She had found it. She had found help. She walked up to the building. The large garage doors were open, and from inside she could hear the clanging sound of metal on metal. She peered into the dim, cool interior. The garage was cluttered. Tools hung from the walls. Car parts were stacked on shelves. The air smelled of oil and gasoline and dust. In the center of the garage, a man was bent over the open hood of an old truck. He was an older man, with gray hair and a sturdy build. His hands, she noticed, were dark with grease, but his movements were careful and precise. Phoebe cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sounding small in the cavernous space. The man straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a red rag that was tucked into his belt. He turned to face her. He had a kind, weathered face and calm blue eyes that looked at her with a quiet curiosity. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Phoebe felt a sudden urge to cry again, this time from relief. She took a breath and explained her situation. She told him about her car, how it had broken down a few miles back on the highway. She tried to describe the sounds it had made, the tapping and the whining and the shuddering. The man listened patiently, his head tilted to one side. He did not interrupt her. He just let her talk until she was finished. When she was done, he nodded slowly. "Sounds like your water pump gave out," he said simply. "Happens to older cars." The calm, simple diagnosis was more comforting than any words of sympathy. He treated it like a normal, everyday problem, not the end-of-the-world disaster it had felt like to Phoebe. "Can you fix it?" she asked, her voice hopeful. "I can fix anything," he said, with a small, quiet smile. "But I'll have to go get the car first, and I might have to order the part. It'll take some time." He introduced himself as Ben. He told her to wait, and he disappeared into the back of his truck. He came back with a bottle of cold water and handed it to her. The simple act of kindness almost made her cry again. While Ben went to fetch her car with his tow truck, Phoebe waited in a small, dusty office at the front of the garage. There was a metal desk, a few mismatched chairs, and a calendar on the wall that was 2 years out of date. She sat in one of the chairs, sipping the cold water, feeling the panic inside her slowly recede. She was safe. She had found help. The journey was not over. It was just paused. Ben returned with her car, towing it behind his truck. He maneuvered it into the garage with an expert skill. He opened the hood and began to work. Phoebe watched him, feeling useless. She did not know anything about cars. She could only stand and watch as he moved around the engine, his tools making quiet, efficient sounds. As he worked, he saw the wooden box on the passenger seat, still securely held by the seatbelt. He looked at it for a moment, then looked at Phoebe. He did not ask what it was. He just said, "Looks like you have some special cargo there." The quiet observation, the simple acknowledgement, opened something up in Phoebe. She was tired and vulnerable, and his kindness had lowered her defenses. She found herself telling him. She told him about Gus, about his one eye and his gentle nature. She told him about the years he had spent at the shelter, waiting. She told him about finding the small metal tag in his collar, the one with the address for the Lighthouse. She told him about her promise, about this long, strange journey she was on to take him home. She expected him to look at her like she was crazy. She expected him to give her the same weary, practical look that Maria had given her. But he did not. He stopped working. He put down his wrench and turned to face her fully. He wiped his hands on his red rag and looked at her with his calm, blue eyes. There was no judgment in his gaze. There was only a deep, quiet understanding. "I had a dog once," Ben said, his voice soft. "A beagle named Scout. Had him from the time he was a pup. He was a terrible dog, really. Chewed up everything, dug holes in the yard, barked at the mailman every single day for 14 years. A small smile touched his lips as he spoke. But he was my dog. He followed me everywhere. When I worked out here in the garage, he'd lie right there on that old rug in the corner just watching me. He was the best friend I ever had." Ben looked away for a moment, his eyes distant. "I lost him 3 years ago. It was old age. It was his time. But the silence he left behind, it's a very loud kind of silence. I still look for him in that corner sometimes." He looked back at Phoebe, and she saw the echo of her own grief in his eyes. "What you're doing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That's a good thing, a fine thing. A life is a life. It deserves to be honored. Don't let anyone tell you different." For the first time since Gus had died, Phoebe felt that someone truly understood. She was not just a foolish, sentimental girl. She was a person honoring a life. The realization was a profound relief. The heavy weight of her own secret grief felt lighter, as if Ben had taken some of it from her shoulders and was helping her carry it. It was a shared burden now. She was not alone on this journey after all. Ben told her the car would not be ready until the next morning. He had to get the part from a supplier in a bigger town, and it would not arrive until the morning delivery. He pointed down the street to a small building with a flickering neon sign that said, "Motel." He told her the owner was a good woman and the rooms were clean. He said he would call her there when the car was ready. Phoebe thanked him, her voice thick with emotion. She paid for the tow and the part in advance, using most of the money from her emergency envelope. She took her duffel bag from the back seat of her car. Then, she carefully unbuckled the seatbelt and lifted the wooden box. It felt different in her arms now. It felt less like a sad burden and more like a precious treasure. She carried it with her as she walked down the quiet street to the motel. The motel room was simple. There was a bed with a faded, patterned bedspread, a small table, and a chair. The air conditioner in the window hummed a loud, steady tune. It was a plain, anonymous room, a room that had seen countless travelers pass through. But to Phoebe, it felt like a sanctuary. She placed the wooden box carefully on the small table. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it. She thought about Ben and his dog, Scout. She thought about his simple words of understanding. A life is a life. It deserves to be honored. Her journey had taken an unexpected turn. The breakdown, which had felt like a disaster, had led her to this quiet town, to this kind man. It had led her to an unexpected moment of connection. She was beginning to understand that the journey was not just about the destination. It was not just about reaching the lighthouse. It was about the things that happened along the way. It was about the people she met, the stories she heard. It was about finding kindness in unexpected places. She lay down on the bed, her clothes still dusty from her long walk. She felt a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, but it was a good kind of tired. The panic and fear were gone, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. She was on the right path. She did not know what the rest of the journey would hold. She did not know what she would find at the lighthouse. But for the first time, she felt certain that she would be able to face it. She closed her eyes. The steady hum of the air conditioner filled the small room. It was a soothing sound. She thought of Gus and of Scout and of all the quiet, forgotten lives in the world. They all mattered, every single one. And with that peaceful thought, Phoebe fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. Chapter 4: Miles and Memories. The morning in Harmony Creek was quiet and slow. Phoebe woke to the sound of a bird singing outside her motel room window. The sunlight filtering through the thin curtains was soft and gentle. For a moment, she did not know where she was. The unfamiliar room, the strange bed, the quietness. Then it all came back to her. The breakdown, the long, hot walk, the kindness of the man named Ben. She sat up in bed. The feeling of panic from the day before was gone. In its place was a calm, steady feeling, like a quiet river flowing inside her. She felt rested. The deep, dreamless sleep had washed away the fear and exhaustion. She looked at the wooden box sitting on the table. In the morning light, it seemed to glow with a soft warmth. It was her compass, her true north. It was the reason she was here in this small, forgotten town. She got up and showered in the small bathroom. The water was hot and the pressure was good. It felt like a luxury. She washed away the dust and sweat of the previous day and felt clean and new, ready to begin again. She dressed in her last clean t-shirt and her jeans. She packed her few belongings back into her duffel bag. Before she left the room, she stood for a moment and looked around. It was just a simple, plain room, but she knew she would never forget it. It was the place where her journey had almost ended, and where, instead, it had truly begun. She walked back to the garage. The town was slowly waking up. The sleeping dog she had seen the day before was now sitting on the sidewalk, watching the world with a lazy interest. A woman was sweeping the porch of the small grocery store. The air was cool and fresh, and it smelled of damp earth and coffee. The world felt full of quiet promise. When she reached the garage, she saw her car. It was parked outside, and the hood was closed. It looked whole again. Ben was standing by the open garage door, drinking coffee from a thick ceramic mug. He saw her coming and gave her a small, welcoming nod. He told her the car was ready. The new water pump was in, and he had checked the oil and the other fluids. He said the car was old, but it was strong. It would get her where she was going. Phoebe felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost brought tears to her eyes. This man, this stranger, had not just fixed her car, he had fixed her hope. She paid him the rest of what she owed, her hand steady as she counted out the bills. He wrote her a receipt on a piece of greasy paper. When he handed it to her, his hand briefly touched hers. His skin was rough and calloused from a lifetime of work, but his touch was gentle. "You drive safe now," he said, his blue eyes looking at her with a fatherly concern. "And you tell that dog of yours I said hello to my scout when he sees him." Phoebe could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She got into her car. She carefully placed the wooden box on the passenger seat and buckled it in. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine started immediately, with a smooth, confident hum. It sounded different. It sounded healthy. She looked over at Ben, who was still standing by the garage door, watching her. She raised her hand in a silent wave of thanks. He raised his coffee mug in return. It was a small, simple gesture, but it felt full of meaning. It was a goodbye, a good luck, and a shared understanding all at once. She put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb. She drove slowly down the main street of Harmony Creek, past the grocery store and the post office. In her rearview mirror, she could see Ben growing smaller and smaller until he was just a tiny figure standing in front of his garage. Then she turned a corner, and he was gone. She would never see him again, but she knew she would carry his kindness with her for the rest of the journey, for the rest of her life. Leaving the town behind, Phoebe felt a profound shift inside her. The journey was different now. The breakdown had not been a failure. It had been a necessary stop. It had been a lesson. The world was not as scary or as empty as she had always believed. There was kindness in it. There was understanding. You just had to be open to finding it. The road no longer felt like a lonely, intimidating thing. It felt like a path of discovery. She was no longer just a sad girl on a sad errand. She was a traveler, and she was not entirely alone. The memory of Ben's quiet strength and the thought of his dog Scout rode with her. The loneliness she had felt so sharply the day before was still present, but its edges had softened. It was no longer a painful ache in her chest. It was more like the vast, quiet landscape around her. It was a part of her, a part of the journey. It was a quiet space inside her that was slowly filling up with new experiences, new memories. The landscape began to change again, this time more dramatically. The flat, dusty plains that had surrounded Harmony Creek slowly gave way to gentle, rolling hills. The brown grass was replaced by a tougher, greener scrub. Small, hardy trees began to appear, clustered together in the dips and valleys of the hills. The road began to climb, and as it did, the world seemed to open up around her. The sky felt bigger, a deeper, clearer blue than she had ever seen before. The air that came through her open window was cooler and smelled of pine and damp earth. She was entering a new part of the country, a new world. And this time, she was not just looking at it. She was truly seeing it. She noticed the small things, the details she would have missed before. She saw the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves of the trees, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the road ahead. She noticed the different colors of the soil by the side of the road, from a deep, rich red to a pale, sandy yellow. She saw a hawk circling high overhead, its wings spread wide as it rode the invisible currents of the air. It was like a part of her that had been asleep for a long time was finally waking up. It was the part of her that, as a little girl, had found comfort in the quiet, overlooked details of the world. The girl who had watched the ants and the leaves on the playground was here again, in the driver's seat of this old car, watching the world unfold with a quiet sense of wonder. The world was beautiful. It was a simple, profound thought. She had lived her whole life without really noticing it. Her world had been the gray concrete of the shelter, the four plain walls of her apartment. But out here, the world was alive with color and texture and light. It was a vast, complex, and beautiful thing, and she was a small part of it, moving through it. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky. The hills grew taller, their slopes covered in thick forests of dark green pine trees. The road became a winding ribbon, curving and climbing through the majestic landscape. Phoebe felt a growing sense of peace. The steady hum of the repaired engine was a comforting sound. The quiet presence of the box on the seat beside her was a constant, gentle reminder of her purpose. This was a pilgrimage. The word, which had felt strange and too grand before, now felt right. She was on a sacred journey, not because of any religion, but because of love. She was traveling to honor a life, to complete a story. It was the most important work she had ever done. As the afternoon began to fade, she felt the first pangs of real hunger. The apple and the peanut butter she had in the back seat no longer seemed appealing. She wanted a real meal. She wanted to sit at a table and eat something warm. Just as the thought crossed her mind, she saw a sign on the side of the road. It was an old, hand-painted sign, the letters faded by the sun and rain. It said, "The Bluebird Diner, good food, hot coffee, next right." On an impulse, she flicked on her turn signal. She was not in a hurry. The journey was not a race. It was something to be experienced. A stop for a meal felt like a part of that experience. She turned onto a smaller side road, and after a few hundred yards, she saw it. The Bluebird Diner was a perfect piece of the past. It was a long, narrow building made of shiny chrome, with big windows and a bright blue roof. It looked like it had been dropped here from another time. A simple neon sign in the window glowed with the words, "Open." She pulled her car into the gravel parking lot and parked next to a large, dusty truck. She turned off the engine, and the quiet of the mountains settled around her. She looked at the diner. It looked warm and inviting. For a moment, she felt a familiar hesitation, the shyness that always made it hard for her to walk into a new place alone. But then she thought of Ben and of her promise to herself to be open to the journey. She took a deep breath, got out of the car, and walked toward the front door. A small bell chimed as she opened the door and stepped inside. The air was warm and thick with the smells of brewing coffee, frying bacon, and something sweet like cinnamon. The inside of the diner was just as she had imagined it. There was a long counter with round red vinyl stools. On the other side of the room were cozy booths, also upholstered in red vinyl that was cracked in a few places. The floor was a black and white checkered pattern, worn smooth by the footsteps of countless customers. The place was quiet, but not empty. A quiet, friendly hum of activity filled the space. A waitress with a kind, tired face was pouring coffee for a man sitting at the counter. He was a truck driver, she guessed, from his worn jeans and the dusty cap on his head. He was eating a large plate of food with a slow, steady rhythm. In one of the booths, an elderly couple sat across from each other. They were not talking. The man was reading a newspaper, and the woman was just looking out the window, a small, contented smile on her face. They shared a comfortable silence, the kind that comes from spending a lifetime together. In another booth, a young family was finishing their meal. The father was helping his small son put on his jacket. The mother was wiping the sticky fingers of her daughter with a napkin. The children were wriggling and making small, happy noises. The parents looked tired, but their faces were full of a deep, patient love. Phoebe stood by the door for a moment, just taking it all in. She was an observer, just as she had been on the playground all those years ago. But this time, it felt different. She did not feel separate from these people. She did not feel excluded. She felt a quiet sense of connection to them. They were all on their own journeys, living their own stories. Their paths had all crossed here, in this small, warm diner in the middle of the mountains. And for a little while, she was a part of it too. She was another traveler, another thread in the rich tapestry of life that was unfolding in this simple, ordinary place. The waitress saw her and gave her a warm smile. "Sit anywhere you like, honey," she said, her voice friendly and welcoming. Phoebe chose a small booth by the window. The red vinyl was cool against her skin. She looked out the window at the tall pine trees and the darkening sky. The waitress brought her a menu and a glass of water. Phoebe ordered a simple meal, a grilled cheese sandwich, and a bowl of tomato soup. It was the kind of food that promised comfort. While she waited for her food, she watched the other people in the diner. She watched the old couple. The man folded his newspaper and said something to his wife. She turned from the window and smiled at him. He reached across the table and patted her hand. It was a small, simple gesture, but it was filled with a world of shared memories and quiet affection. Phoebe felt a small pang of loneliness then. It was a gentle sadness, a quiet wish that she had someone to share this moment with, someone to sit across from her in this warm, cozy booth, someone to talk to about the long road and the changing scenery. The feeling was there, but it did not overwhelm her. It was just a fact, like the checkered pattern on the floor or the smell of coffee in the air. It was a part of her story, the story of a quiet girl on a long journey alone. Her food arrived, hot and fragrant. The soup was thick and rich, and the sandwich was perfectly golden brown, oozing with melted cheese. She took a bite. It was simple, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. The warmth of the food spread through her, chasing away the last of the road's chill. She ate slowly, savoring every bite. She was not in a hurry. This moment, this place, was a part of the journey too. It was a moment of rest, of nourishment, of quiet observation. It was a gift. By the time she finished her meal, the family with the small children had left. The truck driver at the counter paid his bill, left a tip, and walked out into the twilight, heading back to his own long road. The old couple stood up to leave, moving slowly and carefully together, a single unit. Phoebe was the only customer left. She paid for her meal, leaving a generous tip for the kind waitress. As she walked to the door, the waitress called out to her, "You have a safe trip now, you hear?" "Thank you, I will," Phoebe said, and she meant it. She stepped back out into the cool mountain air. The sky was now a deep, velvety blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear. The world was quiet and beautiful. She felt full, not just from the food, but from the experience. The Bluebird Diner had been a small, bright island of warmth and humanity on her long, lonely road. It had reminded her that even when you are traveling alone, you are never truly separate from the world. Back in her car, she did not start the engine right away. She sat in the quiet darkness of the parking lot, looking up at the stars. They were brighter here, away from the city lights. They were sharp, brilliant points of light scattered across the vast, dark canvas of the sky. She felt a sense of awe, a feeling of being very small in a very large and beautiful universe. She continued to drive, but her pace was slower now. The road was dark, illuminated only by the twin beams of her headlights cutting through the blackness. The mountains were huge, dark shapes against the starry sky. She felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. After about another hour of driving, she saw a small sign on the side of the road. It was a simple brown sign with a picture of a person looking through binoculars. It said, "Scenic Viewpoint, quarter mile." She had passed signs like this before and had never thought to stop. But tonight was different. The journey was different. She was different. She slowed down and pulled into the small paved lookout area. She was the only one there. She turned off the engine and the car was plunged into a profound silence. It was a silence deeper than any she had ever known. It was the ancient silence of the mountains, a silence that was full of a quiet, powerful presence. She got out of the car. The air was crisp and cold. She walked to the low wooden railing at the edge of the viewpoint. She looked out. The sight that met her eyes made her gasp. Below her, a vast valley stretched out, a deep, dark sea of trees. A river, looking like a ribbon of silver in the moonlight, snaked its way through the bottom of the valley. On the far side, the dark shapes of more mountains rose up to meet the starry sky. The world was laid out before her, beautiful and vast and silent. She felt a sense of reverence, as if she were standing in a great, natural cathedral. She stood there for a long time, just looking, trying to absorb the immense beauty of it all. This was what Gus had missed. This beauty, this peace, this vast, quiet world. The thought made her turn and walk back to her car. She opened the passenger door. She unbuckled the seatbelt and carefully lifted the wooden box. She carried it back to the railing, holding it in both hands. It felt solid and real in the cool night air. She placed it on the wide, flat top of the wooden railing. It sat there, a small, simple shape against the vast, magnificent backdrop of the valley and the stars. And then she began to talk. Her voice was quiet, barely a whisper in the great silence of the mountains. It felt strange to speak aloud, but it also felt right. This was a place for speaking truths. "Gus," she began, her voice a little shaky. "We made it through another day. It was a hard day at first. The car broke down. I thought it was all over. I was so scared." She paused, remembering the feeling of absolute panic on the side of that empty road. "But then I met a man named Ben. He was a mechanic. He was so kind, Gus. He fixed the car. He told me about his dog, Scout. He said he understood. He made me feel like this wasn't a crazy thing to be doing." She reached out and touched the smooth wood of the box. "And then we came here, to these mountains. They're so big, Gus, so beautiful. I stopped at a little diner and had the best grilled cheese sandwich. I watched all the people. I think you would have liked it there. It was warm and safe." She took a deep breath, the cold mountain air filling her lungs. "I'm not scared anymore," she said, and she realized as she said it that it was true. "I'm a little lonely. I wish you were really here, sitting next to me. I wish I could feel your head resting on my knee. But I'm not scared." She fell silent for a long time, just looking out at the valley. The river glittered below. The stars shone above. She felt a deep sense of connection to this place, to this moment. Then she spoke again, her voice even quieter. "I was thinking about you today," she said. "Not just you at the shelter. I was thinking about your life before you came to us." She looked at the box as if it could provide her with the answers. "Who were you, Gus? Did you have a different name? Buster, maybe? Or something else?" Her mind began to paint pictures. She imagined a younger Gus, a Gus with two bright, clear eyes. She saw him running, not in a small, fenced-in yard, but on a wide, sandy beach. She could almost feel the cool, damp sand under his paws. She could see him chasing after a piece of driftwood, his body strong and full of joy. She could taste the salt in the air, feel the cool spray of the ocean on his fur. She imagined the lighthouse tall and white against a stormy sky. She saw a man, Arthur, with a kind, weathered face, throwing the driftwood for Gus to fetch. She heard the man's laughter, a deep, warm sound that was carried away by the wind. She saw them together in a small, cozy cottage at the base of the lighthouse. A fire was burning in the hearth. Gus was lying on a soft rug in front of the fire, his fur warm, his belly full. He was safe. He was loved. He was home. She imagined him sitting with Arthur on the cliffs, watching the fishing boats come and go. She imagined the feel of Arthur's hand on his head, a familiar, comforting weight. She imagined a life of simple, quiet routines, a life of loyalty and companionship, a life full of the sound of the waves and the smell of the sea. These were not memories. They were dreams. They were stories she was weaving in the quiet darkness, but they felt real. They felt true. She was giving him back his past. She was making his story whole again. The shelter was not his whole life. It was just a chapter, a long, sad chapter, but not the only one. He had known love. He had known joy. He had known a home. The knowledge settled deep inside her, a warm and comforting feeling. It changed everything. This journey was no longer just about returning his ashes to a place he had once lived. It was about returning him to his story. It was about honoring the fullness of his life, the happy parts as well as the sad ones. She reached out and placed both of her hands on the wooden box. "You had a good life," she whispered. It was a good life. She stood there for a long time, with her hands on the box under the vast, starry sky. A quiet sense of joy began to bloom in her heart. This pilgrimage was not a sad duty. It was a celebration. It was a beautiful, loving act of remembrance. She carefully picked up the box and carried it back to the car. She placed it on the passenger seat and buckled it in. As she drove away from the viewpoint, she did not look back. Her eyes were on the road ahead. The road was still long. The journey was not over. But her heart was no longer heavy with grief. It was full of peace and purpose and a quiet, shining love for the old, one-eyed dog who was her friend. Chapter 5. The Taste of Salt. The night spent in the mountains gave way to another dawn, this one soft and hazy. Phoebe woke in her car, which she had pulled into a small, designated rest area not long after leaving the scenic viewpoint. Sleep had found her easily, a deep and peaceful rest, wrapped in the cool, silent embrace of the high country. She had woken a few times in the night, not from a bad dream, but from the profound stillness. Each time, she had seen the brilliant, unblinking stars through her windshield and had felt a sense of profound safety, as if the ancient mountains themselves were watching over her. She started the car, the engine humming to life with its newfound health, and continued her journey. The road began to descend. For 2 days, she had been climbing, moving up into the sky. Now she was heading down, leaving the high peaks behind her. The change was gradual at first. The dense forests of tall, dark pine trees began to thin out. They were replaced by different kinds of trees, trees with wider leaves and softer shapes. The air, which had been so crisp and thin, began to feel thicker, heavier with a moisture she could not yet name. The world was turning from a cool, sharp green to a warmer, more humid green. The sun felt different too. In the mountains, it had been a brilliant, almost white light. Here, as she descended, the sunlight seemed to turn a warmer shade of yellow, filtered through the growing humidity in the air. She drove for hours, watching the world transform outside her windows. The road straightened out, leaving the tight curves of the mountains for long, gentle stretches that ran through rolling green countryside. The sense of peace she had found at the viewpoint stayed with her. It was a quiet, steady presence, a warm stone settled in her chest. She was no longer just running from a sad ending. She was driving toward a beginning, toward the start of Gus's story. The images she had created in her mind the night before of Gus running on a beach, of the kind-faced lighthouse keeper, played over and over in her thoughts. They were her own private film, a story she was creating out of love and a few scant clues. They made the wooden box on the seat beside her feel less like a container of ashes and more like a vessel of hope. It started subtly. She did not notice it at first. It was just a change in the background noise, a new sound, high and mournful, that wove itself into the hum of the engine and the rush of the wind. She thought it might be a bird she did not recognize, but the sound grew more frequent, more insistent. Then she saw them. They were large white birds, gliding on the wind with an effortless grace she had never seen before. They were gulls. She had only ever seen them in pictures. Her heart gave a small, excited leap. She was getting closer. Then came the change in the smell. For days, the air had smelled of pine and damp earth, or of hot asphalt and dry grass. But now, a new scent began to creep in through her open window. It was a faint, clean smell, a little bit sharp, a little bit wild. It was a smell that spoke of vast, open spaces. She breathed it in deeply. It was the smell of salt. At first, it was just a hint, a whisper on the wind. But as she drove on, the scent grew stronger, more definite. It was a thick, rich smell, full of life and decay. It smelled of wet sand and drying seaweed and something else, something vast and powerful and ancient. It was the smell of the ocean. It filled the car. It filled her lungs. It seemed to seep into her very skin. It was a smell of arrival. She rolled down her window all the way, leaning her head out into the wind, wanting to be completely surrounded by it. The air was thick and heavy on her face, cool and damp. It tasted of salt. After so many miles, after so many days of inland travel, this was it. This was the edge of the continent. This was the beginning of Gus's world. The excitement inside her was a bright, soaring feeling, like one of the gulls she had seen. She wanted to laugh. She wanted to shout. Instead, she just drove, a wide, quiet smile on her face. The landscape flattened out completely. The trees became sparse, bent and twisted into strange, wind-swept shapes, as if they were constantly bowing to a powerful, invisible force coming from the west. The grass was long and pale, and it moved in constant, waving patterns like a sea of its own. And then she saw it. Through a gap in the low, rolling dunes, she caught her first glimpse of the water. It was not the gentle blue she had seen in pictures. It was a deep, powerful gray-green, stretching out to the horizon until it met a pale, cloudy sky. It was not still. It was in constant, churning motion, a vast, breathing thing. White lines of foam appeared and disappeared on its surface. It was more immense, more powerful, and more beautiful than she had ever imagined. She pulled the car over onto the sandy shoulder of the road. She had to get out. She had to feel it. She turned off the engine, and the sound of the ocean rushed in to fill the silence. It was not a quiet sound. It was a deep, constant roar, the sound of 1,000,000 tons of water moving and crashing. It was a sound that was both peaceful and violent at the same time. She took off her shoes and socks, leaving them on the floor of the car. She walked away from the road, her bare feet sinking into the soft, cool sand of the dunes. The long grass whipped against her legs. She climbed to the top of a low dune and stood there, looking out at the vast expanse of the ocean. The wind was strong here. It pulled at her clothes and tangled her hair. It was a wild, clean wind, full of the taste of salt. Below her, a wide, empty beach stretched out in both directions. The sand was a pale, creamy color, wet and dark near the water's edge. The waves rolled in, one after another, in a steady, endless rhythm. They would gather themselves up, rise into a churning line of white, and then crash down onto the sand with a deep, booming sound, sending a wide, flat sheet of white foam rushing up the beach. Then, just as quickly, the water would retreat, pulling the sand back with it, making a soft, hissing sound. It was a powerful, hypnotic dance. Rise, crash, retreat. Rise, crash, retreat. Phoebe stood there for a long time, mesmerized. She had never felt so small. Her own small worries, her own quiet life, seemed insignificant next to this vast, ancient power. This was a world that did not care about broken cars or small amounts of money. It was a world that had been here long before she was born and would be here long after she was gone. The thought was not scary. It was comforting. It put her own life into perspective. She walked down the dune and onto the beach. The sand was cool and firm under her feet. She walked toward the water's edge. The air was thick with a fine, salty mist that settled on her skin and eyelashes. She stood where the last of the foam from the waves could just touch her toes. The water was shockingly cold, but it felt wonderful. It felt alive. She thought of the story she had woven for Gus. She imagined him here, on this very beach, his fur wet, his body alive with the joy of running. She imagined him chasing the waves, barking at the gulls. She could almost see him, a joyful ghost, running along the water's edge. This was his home, this landscape of wind and sand and roaring water. He had belonged here. The knowledge settled in her heart, a quiet, happy certainty. The journey had been long and hard, but it had been right. She had brought him back to his place. She stayed on the beach until the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the clouds in shades of soft pink and orange. A feeling of deep peace had settled over her. This place was not just Gus's home. It felt like a part of her home now, too. She walked back to her car, her feet sandy, her hair tangled, her skin tasting of salt. She felt changed. She felt like she had been washed clean by the sea and the wind. She got back in the car and continued down the road, which now ran right along the coast. The ocean was her constant companion, always there to her right, a vast and powerful presence. After a few more miles, she saw a sign. Port Blossom, founded 1887. The town appeared suddenly, nestled in a small, protected cove. It was just as she had imagined it from the old library photos, only more real, more weathered. It was a small cluster of wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth against the constant wind. Most of the buildings were painted in faded colors, blues and grays and whites, the paint peeled and blistered by the salt and the sun. They leaned into each other, their roofs steep and their windows small. The whole town seemed to be braced against the weather. She drove slowly down the main street, which was also the only street. There was a small harbor filled with fishing boats, their tall masts bobbing and swaying in the water. The boats looked as tired and as sturdy as the buildings. Their hulls were scraped and stained, and they smelled of fish and diesel and salt. Nets were piled on the docks, and stacks of lobster traps stood in tall, crooked towers. The air was thick with the smells of the sea and the work of the sea. The town was quiet. There were a few people walking on the wooden sidewalks, but they moved with a slow, deliberate purpose. They were older, most of them, with faces that were as weathered as the buildings. The skin around their eyes was crinkled from a lifetime of squinting into the sun and the wind. They were dressed in practical, sturdy clothes, flannel shirts and thick sweaters, even though the air was not that cold. They looked strong and reserved, a part of the tough landscape. As Phoebe drove by, a few of them looked up at her car. Their gazes were not unfriendly, but they were curious. They were the looks of people in a small, isolated place who knew every car, every face. Her car was new. Her face was new. She was an outsider. The feeling was immediate and undeniable. This was not the easy warmth of the Bluebird Diner or the quiet kindness of Ben's garage. This was a closed community, a place that held its secrets close. The feeling made her old shyness return. She felt her hands tighten on the steering wheel. What was she doing here? Who was she to come into this place, a stranger with a box of ashes, and ask questions about a past that was not hers? She parked her car in front of a building that had a simple hand-painted sign that said, General Store. It seemed like the heart of the town, the place to start. She took a deep breath. She had come too far to turn back now. She had faced a broken-down car and a long, empty road. She could face a few curious stares. She got out of the car, leaving the wooden box on the seat. This was a task she had to do alone. A small bell, rusted and green, chimed above the door as she entered the store. The inside was dim and smelled of old wood, coffee, and something else. A faint, spicy smell like cinnamon. The store was packed from floor to ceiling with everything a person could need in a small, isolated town. There were shelves of canned goods, bags of flour and sugar, coils of rope, bright yellow rain slickers, rubber boots, fishing lures, and jars of penny candy. The wooden floors were dark and worn smooth, and they creaked with every step she took. Behind a long wooden counter at the back of the store stood a man. He was as weathered as everything else in Port Blossom. He was old, with a thick head of white hair and a face that was a road map of deep lines. He was watching her, his eyes a pale, faded blue, the color of the sky on a cloudy day. He did not smile. He just waited. Phoebe walked slowly to the counter, her footsteps echoing in the quiet store. She felt like a child. She felt like an intruder. "Hello?" she said, her voice sounding too loud. The man just nodded. "I'm looking for an address," she said, her voice getting smaller. "I'm looking for Lighthouse Road." The man's expression did not change, but she saw a flicker of something in his pale eyes. It was a flicker of interest, of curiosity. He took a long, slow moment to answer. "You found the right town," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound, like stones rolling in the surf. "But Lighthouse Road ain't much of a road, and there ain't much on it." He paused again, studying her face. "There's only one person lives out there," he said, his voice dropping a little lower, as if he were sharing a secret. "Old Man Arthur, the keeper." Arthur. The name was real. The man was real. He was not just a character in a story she had made up. He was a real person. Old Man Arthur. Phoebe's heart began to beat faster. This was it. This was the end of the line. "Is it far?" she asked. "About 3 miles south of town," the store owner said. He gestured with his thumb toward the window. "Just follow this road. It's the only one. It gets narrow, and it gets rough. You be careful, especially if the wind picks up." He looked at her car through the window, then back at her. The curiosity in his eyes was stronger now. "You got business with Arthur?" he asked. The question was direct, but not unkind. It was the simple, straightforward curiosity of a man who knew everyone's business because there was so little business to know. Phoebe hesitated. How could she explain? How could she tell this stranger about Gus, about the collar, about her long, strange promise? She decided on the simplest truth. "I have something to deliver to him," she said. The store owner nodded slowly, accepting her answer, though his eyes told her he knew there was more to the story. He did not press her. "Well," he said, turning to wipe down a section of his clean counter with a cloth. "He ain't much for company." The words were a quiet warning. Phoebe thanked him and turned to leave. As she walked out of the store, the little bell chiming her departure, she felt his eyes on her back. She knew that by tonight, the whole town of Port Blossom would know that a strange girl in a strange car had come to town, asking for Old Man Arthur. She got back in her car, her mind racing. Arthur. He was real. He was just 3 miles away. The end of her long journey was so close now, she could almost touch it. She started the car and continued south, leaving the small huddle of buildings behind. Just as the store owner had said, the road was the only one. It was paved at first, but soon the asphalt gave way to packed dirt and gravel, and it became narrow. It was a thin, winding ribbon clinging to the edge of the cliffs. On one side was a steep, rocky wall. On the other side was a sheer drop to the ocean below. The water churned and crashed against the dark, jagged rocks. There was no guardrail. The wind had picked up just as the man had warned. It pushed and pulled at her small car, making it hard to keep it steady on the narrow track. She slowed down, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. Her fear was a cold, sharp thing in her stomach. This was a dangerous road. It was a road that did not welcome visitors. But she kept going. Her determination was stronger than her fear. She thought of Gus. She thought of her promise. She thought of the long miles she had traveled to get to this one, final stretch of road. With every turn, the view became more wild, more dramatic. The coastline was a rugged, violent place, a battleground where the land and the sea were locked in an endless fight. The power of it was terrifying, but it was also beautiful. It was a raw, untamed beauty, the kind she had never seen before. She felt like she was driving to the very edge of the world, and then she saw it. She came around a sharp bend in the road, and there it was, standing on a high, rocky point of land that jutted out into the sea. The lighthouse. It was taller than she had imagined, a stark white tower rising up from the dark gray rock. It was elegant and strong, a slender, graceful shape against the vast, churning ocean and the pale, empty sky. It looked both beautiful and incredibly lonely. It was a solitary sentinel, a lonely guardian watching over the dangerous waters. It was intimidating. It was a place of power and isolation. Next to the base of the lighthouse, nestled into a small hollow in the rock to protect it from the wind, was a small stone cottage. It was as sturdy and as weathered as the lighthouse itself. Its roof was made of dark slate, and a thin curl of gray smoke rose from its single stone chimney. Someone was home. Arthur was home. Phoebe slowed the car to a stop. She was still a few hundred yards away. She just sat there, looking. The final destination, the end of the road, the place that had existed only in her imagination and on a small, tarnished piece of metal was now real, right in front of her. She had made it. She had kept her promise. A wave of emotion washed over her, so powerful it took her breath away. It was a mixture of everything she had felt on the journey. The deep grief for Gus, the fear and loneliness of the long road, the warmth of Ben's kindness, the quiet joy of the mountains, the awe of the ocean. It all came together in this one overwhelming moment. She had done it. She had brought him home. She took a deep breath, the salty air filling her lungs. The journey to the lighthouse was over. Now, the journey to Arthur was about to begin, and that, she knew, might be the hardest part of all. Chapter 6. The Keeper and the Wall. Phoebe did not move for a long time. She sat in her car with the engine off, the only sounds the relentless roar of the ocean below and the mournful cry of the gulls circling high above the lighthouse tower. The wind rocked her small car gently, a constant, pushing pressure. She felt as though she were on a boat, adrift in a great, gray sea. The lighthouse and the small stone cottage in front of her were an island, a final, lonely outpost at the end of the world. The reality of the place was more potent and more intimidating than anything she could have imagined. This was not a gentle storybook lighthouse. It was a fortress. It was a place built to withstand storms, a place of solitude and vigilance. The man who lived here, this Arthur, must be a part of it. He must be as strong and as weathered as the stone he lived in. The nervous energy that had been building inside her for days now coalesced into a tight, cold knot in her stomach. Her old, familiar shyness returned, stronger than ever. It was a physical feeling, a desire to shrink, to become invisible. What right did she have to disturb this solitude? Who was she to arrive unannounced, a ghost from a past he had likely long since buried? She looked at the wooden box on the seat beside her. Its quiet, steady presence was the only thing that kept her from turning the car around and driving away. She had not come all this way to fail now. She had driven through plains and mountains. She had slept in her car. She had walked a hot and dusty road. She had made a promise. This was the final step. She had to see it through. With a deep breath that did little to calm her racing heart, she opened the car door. The wind immediately grabbed it, pushing it wide with a force that surprised her. She had to fight to pull it closed. The power of the wind out here was a living thing. It was a constant, invisible river flowing around the point of land. She zipped up her jacket and pulled her hair back, tucking it into her collar. The air was cold and damp, and it carried the thick, briny scent of the sea. She walked slowly toward the cottage, her feet unsteady on the rough, uneven ground. There was no clear path, just a worn track through the tough, windswept grass. Her sneakers, so practical for the shelter, felt flimsy and inadequate here. The ground was hard and rocky beneath the thin layer of soil. As she got closer to the cottage, she could see the details more clearly. It was built from the same dark gray stone as the cliffs it stood on, as if it had grown right out of the rock. The windows were small and deep set, like the eyes of a person squinting against a harsh light. The heavy wooden door was painted a dark sea green, the paint cracked and peeling to reveal the weathered wood beneath. A small, tidy pile of firewood was stacked against one wall. Everything about the cottage spoke of practicality and self-sufficiency. It was a place of work, not comfort. The smoke rising from the chimney was the only sign of warmth, the only invitation in this stark and forbidding landscape. Her heart was beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands were cold and clammy. She rehearsed what she would say, the words feeling clumsy and foolish in her mind. "Hello, my name is Phoebe. You do not know me. I work at an animal shelter hundreds of miles away. I have brought you the ashes of your dog who has been dead for years." The words sounded insane. They sounded like the ramblings of a madwoman. How could anyone react to that with anything other than suspicion and anger? She almost turned back. She almost walked back to her car and left the box on the ground, a silent, anonymous offering. But the thought of Gus's story remaining untold, unfinished, pushed her forward. She reached the dark green door. It was solid and heavy, with a large black iron handle. There was no doorbell, no knocker. She stood there for a full minute, her courage failing her. Then she remembered Ben, the mechanic, and his simple, profound words. A life is a life. It deserves to be honored. She took one last, shaky breath, and then she knocked. She did not knock loudly. It was a hesitant, timid sound, her knuckles rapping lightly against the thick wood. The sound was swallowed immediately by the wind and the sea. She waited. Nothing. No sound from inside, no footsteps. Maybe he was not home. Maybe he was up in the lighthouse. The thought was both a disappointment and a relief. She was about to turn away when she heard a sound from within. It was the scraping of a chair on a stone floor. Then the heavy tread of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate steps. They stopped just behind the door. A moment of silence. Then a metallic click as a bolt was drawn back. The door opened, but only a few inches. A man's face appeared in the narrow gap. He was exactly as she had pictured him, and yet completely different. He was old, probably in his late 70s. His face was a landscape of deep lines and weathered skin, the color of old leather. A thick, untrimmed beard, more white than gray, covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly pale blue, the color of ice. And they were not kind. They were sharp, suspicious, and completely unwelcoming. They were the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime looking at a hard horizon, a man who was not used to and did not want visitors. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe, taking in her city clothes, her wind-tangled hair, her nervous expression. He said nothing. He just waited, his silence a wall, a challenge. Phoebe's carefully rehearsed words vanished from her mind. Her throat was dry. "Arthur?" she managed to whisper, her voice thin and carried away by the wind. The man's expression did not change. His pale eyes narrowed slightly. "Who's asking?" he said. His voice was a low, rough growl, like stones grinding together. It was the voice of a man who did not use it often. "My name is Phoebe," she said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. I've come a long way. I have something for you." The man's gaze flickered down to her empty hands, then back to her face. His suspicion deepened. He did not move. He did not open the door any wider. He just stood there, a silent, unmovable guardian of his own solitude. Phoebe realized she had to explain, as foolish as it sounded. She had to try. "It's about a dog," she said, the words tumbling out in a nervous rush. "An old dog. He was at the animal shelter where I work. He passed away, and we found this, in his collar." She fumbled in her pocket, her cold fingers clumsy. She pulled out the small, tarnished metal tag. She held it out to him in the palm of her hand. The small piece of metal looked insignificant in the vast, windy landscape. The man looked down at the tag. He did not take it. He just stared at it, his face unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the roar of the sea. Phoebe watched his face, searching for any sign of recognition, any flicker of memory. She saw nothing. His face was a mask of stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and cold, completely devoid of emotion. "You've made a mistake," he said. The words were a dismissal, a final judgment. "A mistake?" Phoebe stammered. "But the address—" "1 Lighthouse Road. This is the place." "It's the right place," he said, his icy eyes meeting hers again. "But it's the wrong dog. I've never owned a dog. Not now. Not ever." He said the words with a flat certainty that allowed for no argument. It was a lie. She knew it was a lie. Her heart, which had been beating so fast, now seemed to sink, a heavy weight in her chest. This was not the reunion she had imagined. This was not the tearful discovery, the grateful acceptance of a long-lost friend. This was a wall, a high, cold wall of denial. "But," she started, her mind scrambling for something to say, something to break through the wall. "He was an old dog with one eye, a big, gentle dog." The man's face tightened almost imperceptibly. A muscle in his jaw clenched, but his voice, when he spoke, was even colder than before. "I told you," he said, the words sharp and final. "You've made a mistake. I don't know what kind of story you've made up in your head, but it has nothing to do with me. Now, if you'll excuse me." He began to close the door. "Please," Phoebe said, a note of desperation in her voice. "Please, just listen." His name at the shelter was Gus, but maybe he had another name. The door continued to close, slowly, inexorably. "I don't have time for this," the man's growling voice said from the narrowing gap. And then the door was closed. The heavy sound of the bolt being shot back into place echoed in the sudden silence. He was gone. The wall was complete. Phoebe stood on the doorstep, staring at the solid green wood. She could not believe it. All this way, all these miles, all this hope, all for nothing. He had not even looked at the tag properly. He had not listened. He had just denied it. He had denied Gus. A wave of anger, hot and sharp, cut through her disappointment. How could he? How could he deny his own friend? How could he be so cold, so cruel? The anger was quickly followed by a crushing wave of defeat. The journey, which had felt so right, so full of purpose, now seemed like a ridiculous, naive fantasy. Maria had been right. Ben had been wrong. She was just a foolish, sentimental girl who had chased a ghost across the country. The story she had so carefully woven of the kind keeper and his loyal companion crumbled into dust. The reality was this cold, angry old man and his bolted door. She felt utterly, completely defeated. The wind seemed to mock her, pulling at her jacket, pushing her back toward her car. The sea roared its indifference. She had failed. There was nothing left to do but go. She turned away from the door, her shoulders slumped. Her eyes burned with unshed tears of frustration and shame. She walked back toward her car, her head down, watching her feet move one in front of the other on the rocky ground. She did not want to look at the lighthouse, at the sea, at any of it. It was no longer a place of beauty. It was a place of rejection. She reached her car and got in, slamming the door against the wind. She sat in the driver's seat, her hands limp in her lap. She stared through the windshield at the gray stone cottage. She should start the car. She should drive away. She should drive back down that dangerous road and never look back. But she could not. She could not just leave. She could not let the story end like this. Gus deserved better. He deserved more than a slammed door and a cold denial. He deserved to be acknowledged. He deserved to come home. An idea born of desperation and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat began to form in her mind. She could not force the man to listen. She could not break down his door, but she could leave a message. She could leave Gus himself. She got out of the car again. This time, her movements were not timid. They were deliberate. She opened the passenger door and carefully unbuckled the seatbelt. She lifted the wooden box. It felt heavy in her arms, heavy with the weight of her failed mission. She walked back to the cottage, back to the green door. She knelt down on the cold stone step and gently placed the box in front of the door. It looked small and lonely there. She took a pen and a small notebook from her purse. She tore out a clean sheet of paper. Her hands were shaking, but she forced herself to write. Her message was not angry. It was not pleading. It was simple. It was the truth as she knew it. She wrote only 6 words. He was a good dog. He deserved to come home. She folded the note and tucked it under the edge of the box so the wind would not take it. Then she stood up. She took one last look at the box, her silent offering, her final plea. She did not knock again. She simply turned and walked away. The drive away from the lighthouse was a blur. Phoebe drove automatically, her mind a numb haze of disappointment. She navigated the narrow, winding road with a detached precision, her emotions too raw to allow for fear. She did not look in her rearview mirror. She did not want to see the lonely white tower shrinking in the distance. When she reached the main road, she turned back toward Port Blossom. She did not know what else to do. It was too late in the day to start the long drive home. She needed a place to sleep, a place to hide. She needed a place to figure out what to do next. The town, which had seemed so reserved and unwelcoming just a short time ago, now felt like a haven. It was a place with other people, a place that was not filled with the crushing weight of Arthur's solitude and anger. She drove through the quiet main street and saw the small, flickering neon sign she had noticed earlier. Port Blossom Motel. It was a simple, one-story building, painted a faded sea blue. It looked clean and quiet. She pulled into the small parking lot and turned off the engine. She sat for a moment, the silence of the car a welcome relief after the roar of the wind at the lighthouse. She felt hollowed out, emptied of all the hope and purpose that had sustained her for so many days. The journey was over. She had delivered the package. It had been refused. Her part in the story was done. But it felt all wrong. It felt unfinished, broken. She got out of the car and walked into the small motel office. A woman who was as weathered and as sturdy as the town itself sat behind the counter, knitting. She looked up as Phoebe entered, her eyes kind and curious. Phoebe asked for a room for the night. She paid with the last of her motel money, the bills feeling thin and final in her hand. The woman gave her a key attached to a large plastic tag. She gave Phoebe a long, searching look. "Everything all right, dear?" she asked, her voice surprisingly gentle. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm just tired," Phoebe said, which was true, but it was a deeper tiredness than the woman could ever know. It was a weariness of the soul. She took the key and went to her room. It was a simple, clean room, much like the one in Harmony Creek, but it did not feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage. She locked the door and leaned against it, closing her eyes. The image of the old man's icy, dismissive eyes was burned into her mind. The sound of the bolt sliding shut echoed in her ears. She had tried. She had truly tried, but his wall was too high, too thick. There was nothing more she could do. She walked over to the window and looked out. From her room, she could see the harbor, the masts of the fishing boats swaying gently. The sky was turning a darker shade of gray, and the wind was picking up, rattling the window in its frame. A storm was coming. The thought barely registered. A storm was coming inside her, too. A storm of grief and disappointment and a profound, aching sense of failure. She had let Gus down. She had brought him all this way, only to leave him on a cold, unwelcoming doorstep. It was a worse ending than the dusty shelf in the shelter's storage room. At least there, he would have been at peace. Here, he was a rejected memory, an unwanted ghost. A single hot tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. Then another, and another. She did not bother to wipe them away. She just stood at the window, watching the town prepare for the coming storm, and let the tears fall. A quiet, salty rain for a journey that had ended in heartbreak. Chapter 7. The Light in the Storm. The storm arrived just after nightfall. It did not come gently. It hit Port Blossom with the sudden, violent force of an angry fist. The wind, which had been a constant, steady pressure all day, now rose to a furious howl. It shrieked around the corners of the old motel, rattling the window in Phoebe's room with a desperate, shaking intensity. It was a living sound, a sound full of rage and power. Then came the rain. It was not a soft, cleansing rain. It was a hard, driving deluge thrown sideways by the wind. It lashed against the window pane in solid, horizontal sheets, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the glass. The world outside Phoebe's small room dissolved into a churning chaos of wind and water. The flickering neon sign of the motel cast a blurry, distorted glow on the wet pavement outside, its colors bleeding into the darkness. From her window, she could no longer see the harbor, only the vague, shifting shapes of the buildings across the street, dark and silent against the storm. The town seemed to have battened down its hatches, pulling into itself to wait out the fury of the sea. Phoebe sat on the edge of her bed, listening. The storm was a perfect reflection of the turmoil inside her. The howling wind was the sound of her own grief and frustration. The lashing rain was the sting of her own tears. She felt a strange kinship with the storm. It was wild and heartbroken, just like her. She did not feel frightened by its power. She felt understood. She had been sitting there for hours, a still, quiet figure in the dim light of the bedside lamp. She had not eaten. She had not unpacked her bag. She had just sat, letting the waves of disappointment wash over her again and again. The cold, hard face of the old man, the final definitive sound of the closing door, the image of the small wooden box alone on the cold stone step. The memories played on a loop in her mind, each one a fresh wave of failure. She had been so sure that this journey was the right thing to do. She had felt its rightness in her bones, in the kindness of a stranger, in the beauty of the mountains, in the taste of salt on the air. But she had been wrong. The ending had proven her a fool. 3 miles away, at the edge of the world, Arthur sat in his small stone cottage. The storm, for him, was a familiar companion. He had lived with its fury for more than 50 years. He knew its sounds, its rhythms, its power. The roar of the wind, the crash of the waves against the cliffs below, the rattle of the windows in their frames, these were the sounds of his life. They did not frighten him. They were a part of the deep, profound solitude he had chosen for himself. He sat in a sturdy wooden chair by the hearth, where a low fire crackled and hissed, casting a warm, flickering light on the stone walls and the simple, worn furniture of the room. The cottage was a small, safe pocket of warmth and light in the vast, raging darkness outside. It was his fortress. For 50 years, it had been enough. But tonight, it was not. Tonight, the silence inside the cottage felt different. It was not the peaceful, comforting silence he was used to. It was a heavy, listening silence. It was a silence that was filled with the presence of something new, something unwelcome. On the floor, just inside the door, sat a small, plain wooden box. He had left it on the doorstep for an hour, a stubborn act of denial. He had told himself it was a mistake. Some lost tourist, some crazy person. It had nothing to do with him. He had tried to go about his evening routine. He had made his simple meal of bread and soup. He had checked the light in the tower, its powerful beam cutting its steady, sweeping path through the rain and the darkness. But his eyes kept being drawn back to the door. He could feel the presence of the box on the other side. He could feel it waiting. Finally, as the first hard gusts of the storm began to hit the point, he had opened the door. The wind had almost torn it from his hand. He had snatched the box from the step, along with the small folded note that was tucked beneath it, and had brought them inside, shutting the door quickly against the rising fury of the storm. He had tossed the box onto the floor as if it were a piece of driftwood, something meaningless the tide had washed up. But it was not meaningless, and he knew it. He had not looked at it since. He had just sat by his fire, a prisoner in his own home, while the small, silent box held him captive. The storm was a trigger. Storms always were. They churned up the sea, and they churned up the past. On nights like this, when the world was reduced to the roar of the wind and the warmth of his small fire, the memories always came back. They came back unbidden, ghosts rising from the deep. He remembered other storms, other nights. He remembered a small, warm body curled at his feet, a comforting weight in the wildness of the night. He remembered the soft thump of a tail against the wooden floorboards, a quiet, steady rhythm that had been the heartbeat of his silent life. He remembered a pair of intelligent, trusting eyes looking up at him in the firelight. The girl, the strange, sad-eyed girl who had appeared on his doorstep. The words she had said echoed in his mind. An old dog, with one eye. The detail was a sharp, painful splinter under his skin. How could she have known that? It was a detail he himself had tried to forget for years. He had tried to bury the memory of that day, the day of the fog, the day everything had changed. He had built a wall around that memory, a high, thick wall of stone and silence. For years, the wall had held. But this girl, this stranger, had come and knocked on his door, and now the wall was beginning to crumble. His gaze was finally drawn back to the box on the floor. It was so simple, so plain, so final. Beside it lay the small folded note. He had not read it yet. He had been afraid to. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that reading it would change everything. The storm howled outside, a cry of grief and rage. It seemed to be calling to him, urging him. He could not sit here in silence any longer. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. Slowly, stiffly, he got up from his chair. His old bones ached with the dampness of the storm. He walked over to the door and bent down. He picked up the folded piece of paper. His hand, the hand that could handle thick ropes and heavy machinery with ease, trembled slightly. He walked back to the fire and unfolded the note. The girl's handwriting was neat and simple. The light from the fire flickered on the 6 small words. He was a good dog. Arthur's breath caught in his chest. A wave of memory, so powerful it almost knocked him off his feet, washed over him. He saw a small, clumsy puppy tripping over its own paws. He saw a young, strong dog running on the beach, its body a blur of joyful motion. He saw an older, wiser dog sitting beside him on the cliffs, a silent, steady companion against the vastness of the sea. Yes, he thought, he was a good dog, the best dog. Then he read the last 4 words. He deserved to come home. The wall inside him did not just crumble, it shattered. It exploded into a million pieces, and the past came rushing in. A tidal wave of grief and guilt, and a love so profound it felt like a physical wound. He sank back into his chair, the small piece of paper clutched in his hand. The truth, which he had held at bay for so many years with his stubborn silence, could no longer be denied. The dog in the box was not Gus. His name was Buster, and he had been Arthur's only friend, his only family, his entire world. And Arthur had lost him. He had failed him, and he had never forgiven himself. The face of the girl came back to him, her wide, sad eyes, her nervous, trembling hands. He had seen the hope in her face, and he had thrown it back at her. He had lied to her. He had been cruel. Why? Because her presence, her story, threatened to bring down the wall he had so carefully built around his own heart. Her truth was too painful for him to bear. He had sent her away, back into the storm, a heartbroken girl on a fool's errand. The thought shamed him in a way he had not felt in years. She had traveled all this way, hundreds of miles, a young woman alone, just to honor the life of a forgotten dog. She had shown more love and loyalty to Buster in his death than Arthur had been able to face. He looked at the small wooden box. It was no longer an intrusion. It was a gift, a terrible, heartbreaking, beautiful gift. The girl had brought his boy home, and he had slammed the door in her face. He had to find her. He had to tell her the truth. He had to thank her. The thought was immediate and absolute. He could not wait until morning. He could not let her spend the night believing her journey had been a failure. He had to go now. He stood up, his movements no longer slow and stiff, but filled with a new, urgent purpose. He pulled on his heavy, waterproof coat and his thick rubber boots. He grabbed a large, powerful flashlight from a hook by the door. He was about to leave when his eyes fell on the wooden box. He could not leave him here alone again. He gently picked it up. It felt impossibly light, yet it was the heaviest thing he had ever held. He tucked it carefully inside his coat, holding it securely against his chest with one arm. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the full fury of the storm. The wind hit him like a solid wall, stealing his breath. The rain was a physical assault, cold and stinging against his face. The world was a roaring, churning chaos of blackness and water. But he did not hesitate. He had a light to guide him, and a purpose that burned brighter than any storm. He began the long, treacherous walk back to his truck, which was parked in a small, sheltered lean-to. The journey to Port Blossom, the journey back to the girl, had begun. Phoebe must have fallen asleep. She woke with a start, not knowing what had woken her. The room was dark, the only light the faint, blurry glow from the motel sign outside. The storm was still raging, a constant, deafening roar. She was lying on top of the bedspread, still in her clothes. Her neck was stiff. She sat up, feeling groggy and disoriented. That was when she heard it. It was a sound that did not belong in the storm. It was a loud, insistent banging. It was coming from her door. For a moment, she was paralyzed by fear. Who would be out in this weather? Who would be knocking on her door in the middle of the night? The knocking came again, louder this time, more urgent. It was the sound of a large fist hitting the solid wood. "Miss!" a voice shouted, a rough, gravelly voice that was almost lost in the howling of the wind. "Miss, please, open the door!" The voice was familiar. She had heard it only once before, but she would never forget it. It was Arthur. Her heart leaped into her throat. What was he doing here? Why had he come? Was he angry? Had he come to yell at her for leaving the box? Her mind raced, a jumble of fear and confusion. The knocking came again, a desperate, frantic sound now. "Please, it's Arthur, the lighthouse keeper. I need to talk to you." He sounded different. The cold, hard edge was gone from his voice. It was replaced by something else, a raw, desperate urgency. Phoebe got up from the bed, her legs unsteady. She crept to the door and peered through the small peephole. A distorted, watery image looked back at her. It was him. His face was slick with rain, his white beard plastered to his cheeks. His eyes, which had been so cold and icy, now looked wild and full of a desperate emotion she could not name. He was not angry. He was something else. He was heartbroken. She took a deep breath and unlatched the door, opening it just a crack. The wind tore at it, trying to rip it from her hand. The full force of the storm rushed into the small, warm room, bringing with it the cold smell of the sea. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper against the roar. "Can I come in?" he shouted over the wind. "Just for a minute, please." She hesitated for a second, then she opened the door wider and stepped back. He stumbled into the room, bringing the storm in with him. He was a large, imposing figure, dripping water onto the thin carpet. He pushed the door shut behind him, the latch clicking loudly, and the roar of the storm was suddenly muffled, reduced to a distant, angry howl. They stood in the small, dimly lit room, facing each other. He looked completely different from the man who had closed his door on her. His face was etched with a deep, profound sadness. His shoulders were slumped, not with age, but with the weight of a heavy burden. He reached a hand inside his thick, wet coat. For a wild moment, Phoebe was afraid, but he did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out the small, plain wooden box. He held it out to her, his large, weathered hands trembling. "His name was Buster," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer contain. The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. "He was my dog. He was my boy." The truth when it came was so simple and so pure that it broke through all of Phoebe's own sadness and anger. She looked at his face, at the raw grief in his pale eyes, and she saw not an enemy, but a fellow mourner. She saw a heart that was just as broken as her own. "I know," she said softly. Arthur shook his head, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "No, you don't," he said, his voice cracking. "You don't know the whole story. No one does." He looked around the small, impersonal motel room, then back at her. His gaze was pleading. Will you come back to the cottage with me? When the storm passes, I need to tell you. I need to tell someone." Phoebe looked at the old man, his face a mask of sorrow, his large frame trembling. He was no longer the intimidating keeper of the light, the guardian of a stone fortress. He was just a lonely old man who had lost his best friend. "The storm is bad," she said, her voice gentle. "You shouldn't be out in it. There's a small cafe here at the motel. It's closed, but the owner, she's a kind woman. Maybe she would let us sit there. It's warm." Arthur just nodded, his gaze dropping to the wooden box in his hands. He seemed unable to speak. Phoebe found her jacket and led him out of her room, back into the wind and the rain. They made their way to the motel office, where a single light was still burning. The woman at the counter looked up in surprise as they entered, dripping and windswept. Phoebe quickly explained. The woman's kind, curious eyes looked from Phoebe's earnest face to the old man's raw, undisguised grief. She did not ask any questions. She simply nodded, took a key from a hook behind the counter, and led them to the small, dark cafe next door. She unlocked the door and turned on a single, low light. "I'll make a pot of coffee," she said, and then she left them alone. The cafe was a simple, clean space with a few small tables. It smelled of old coffee and cinnamon. It was a quiet, neutral ground. Arthur sank into one of the chairs, placing the wooden box gently on the table in front of him. He put his head in his hands, his large shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Phoebe sat down across from him. She did not say anything. She did not touch him. She just sat with him in the quiet, dimly lit room, a silent witness to a grief that had been held in for far too long. The motel owner returned with a pot of hot coffee and 2 mugs. She placed them on the table without a word and then quietly left, closing the door behind her. The only sound in the room was the drumming of the rain against the windows and the old man's quiet, broken sobs. After a long time, the sobs subsided. He took a deep, shuddering breath and sat up. He wiped his face with the back of his rough hand. He looked at Phoebe, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. "I am sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I am so sorry for how I treated you." "It's okay," Phoebe said, and she meant it. "No," he said, shaking his head. "It's not. You came all this way. You brought him home. And I was a coward." He poured 2 cups of coffee, his hands still shaking. The dark, fragrant steam rose into the air between them. He pushed one of the mugs toward her. Then he looked at the wooden box on the table, and he began to speak. He began to tell her the story of Buster. His voice was low and rough, but it was filled with a deep, abiding love. He told her how he had found Buster as a small, abandoned puppy, left in a box by the side of the road. He told her about their years together, a life of quiet companionship, of shared solitude. Buster was his shadow, his confidant, his reason for getting up in the morning. He was the keeper of the lighthouse, but Buster was the keeper of his heart. Then his voice grew quiet and heavy with pain. He told her about the day of the fog. It had rolled in from the sea, thick and white and silent, swallowing the whole world. A family of tourists, new to the area, had been walking on the cliffs. Their young son had wandered off, disappearing into the white wall of the fog. The parents were frantic. Arthur had known the cliffs better than anyone, and Buster had known them even better. His sense of smell was a miracle. Together they had gone out into the fog, into the disorienting whiteness, to search for the lost child. Buster had found him. He had followed the boy's scent to a dangerous, crumbling ledge where the child was huddled, crying and terrified. Buster had stayed with the boy, barking to guide the rescuers, his loud, steady bark a beacon of hope in the silent fog. They had found the boy, safe and sound. He was a hero. But in the chaos of the rescue, in the thick, confusing whiteness, Buster had been injured. He had slipped on a wet rock, and a piece of his collar had caught on a jagged edge. In his panic, he had pulled free, leaving the collar behind, and had run off into the fog, limping badly. Arthur had heard his frantic yelp, but by the time he got there, Buster was gone. He had searched for days, for weeks, for months. He had walked every inch of the coastline, calling his name until his voice was raw. He had never given up hope, but Buster was never found. The child was saved, but Arthur had lost everything. The guilt had consumed him. He felt he had sacrificed his best friend for a stranger's child. The pain was too great to bear, so he had built his wall. He had buried the memory, buried the love, buried the grief. He had convinced himself that it was better to feel nothing than to feel that unbearable pain again. He had lived in that cold, silent prison for years until Phoebe had arrived on his doorstep, holding the key. As he finished his story, the first light of dawn was beginning to break through the storm clouds. The rain had softened to a gentle patter. The wind had died down to a low whisper. He looked at Phoebe, his face awash in the pale morning light. "He didn't just get lost," Arthur said, his voice thick with tears. "He was a hero. His story. It was a hero's story, and I buried it. I was so ashamed of losing him that I buried his greatness." Phoebe looked at the old, heartbroken man, and her own grief for Gus was transformed. It was no longer just about the sad ending of a lonely shelter dog. It was about the heroic life of a brave, loyal friend named Buster. Her journey had not been a failure. It had been a rescue mission. She had not just brought home a box of ashes. She had brought home a story of love and loss and incredible courage. A story that had been lost in the fog for far too long. She reached across the table and placed her small young hand over his large, weathered one. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for telling me his story." And in the quiet, clean light of the morning after the storm, a new, gentle bond formed between the old keeper and the young traveler. A bond forged in shared grief and the powerful, enduring light of a hero's memory. Chapter 8: Where the Sea Meets the Sky. The world after the storm was a different place. It was washed clean, scrubbed raw. The air was crystalline, so clear and sharp it felt like a brand new atmosphere. The sky, which had been a uniform, angry gray for so long, was now a vast, pale blue, streaked with soft, feathery white clouds that were being pushed gently out to sea by a calm, clean wind. The sun, when it rose fully, was not the hazy, humid sun of the coast. It was a brilliant, almost white sun, its light sharp and defining, casting long, dark shadows on the wet ground. Everything glittered. The puddles in the motel parking lot were like scattered pieces of a broken mirror, reflecting the brilliant sky. The leaves on the few hardy bushes that grew in the town were covered in a million tiny water droplets, each one a perfect, shining jewel. The world smelled new. The air was free of dust, thick with the clean green scent of wet earth, the salty tang of the sea, and a faint sweet smell, like damp flowers. It was a world reborn. Phoebe felt reborn with it. The storm that had raged inside her had passed, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. The grief for Gus, for Buster, was still there. It was a gentle ache in her heart, a quiet companion. But it was no longer a sharp, tearing pain. It had been softened by understanding, by the sharing of a story. It had been transformed from a lonely burden into a shared memory. She and Arthur had sat in the small, quiet cafe for a long time, talking as the dawn broke. After the great emotional rush of his story, a comfortable quiet had settled between them. They drank their coffee, the warmth of the mugs seeping into their cold hands. They did not need to say much more. The most important things had already been said. Arthur had looked at her, his pale eyes, once so cold and distant, now filled with a deep, weary gratitude. He had apologized again for his cruelty, for his fear, and she had told him again that it was all right, that she understood, and she truly did. She understood that his wall had not been built out of anger, but out of a love so deep that its loss had been unbearable. The kind woman from the motel office had returned as the sun was rising. She had brought them a plate of warm muffins, her silent offering to their shared vigil. They had eaten together, the old man and the young woman, two strangers brought together by the ghost of a good dog. A bond had been forged in the storm, a quiet, unspoken friendship that felt as old and as sturdy as the weathered town around them. Arthur had insisted that she come back to the lighthouse with him, not as a visitor this time, but as a guest, as a friend. He wanted her to see Buster's home. He wanted her to see the place where his story had unfolded. Phoebe had agreed without hesitation. Her journey was not quite over. There was one final chapter to be written. Arthur had driven her back to the lighthouse in his old, rattling truck. The treacherous road along the cliffs looked different in the clean morning light. The sea below was no longer an angry, churning gray. It was a deep, brilliant blue, sparkling in the sunlight, the waves rolling in with a calm, steady rhythm, their white crests gentle and peaceful. The lighthouse, when they arrived, no longer looked like an intimidating fortress. It looked like what it was, a beacon, a place of light and hope. The small stone cottage, which had seemed so cold and unwelcoming, now looked like a cozy, safe harbor. Inside, the cottage was just as she had imagined from Arthur's stories. It was simple and spare, filled with practical handmade furniture. But it was also warm and full of a quiet, personal history. There were shelves filled with old books, their covers worn and soft from years of reading. There were nautical charts on the walls, their lines and numbers telling the secret stories of the sea. And in a corner, near the stone hearth, was a faded oval-shaped rug. It was worn thin in the middle, the colors faded almost to nothing. It was the place where Buster had slept for all those years. The sight of it made Phoebe's heart ache with a gentle, bittersweet sadness. This was his spot, his place. He was a part of this room, a presence that was as real and as tangible as the stone walls. They had a simple breakfast together at a small wooden table. Arthur made porridge, thick and warm, and more strong black coffee. They ate in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the gentle crackle of the fire and the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves. The storm had passed, and a great calm had settled over the point of land and over the two quiet souls within the cottage. After they had eaten, Arthur stood up. "Come," he said, his voice quiet. "There's a place I want to show you." He led her out of the cottage. The air was cool and clean. He walked not toward the lighthouse tower, but in the other direction, toward a narrow, winding path that led up the grassy slope behind the cottage. The path was steep, but Arthur climbed it with a slow, steady gait, his old legs sure-footed on the familiar ground. Phoebe followed him, her own legs feeling strong and light. They climbed in silence, the world opening up around them with every step. The view was breathtaking. They could see the entire coastline stretching out for miles in both directions, a rugged, beautiful line where the green land met the blue sea. They could see the small, safe harbor of Port Blossom in the distance, the fishing boats looking like tiny toys. They could see the vast, endless expanse of the ocean, stretching out to meet the pale blue curve of the sky. It felt like they were standing on the very top of the world. The path ended at a small, flat patch of ground at the very edge of the cliffs. It was a natural lookout point, a place of immense beauty and profound peace. The grass here was short and soft, like a green carpet. A single flat-topped boulder sat near the edge, a perfect, natural bench. Arthur walked over to the boulder and ran his hand over its rough, sun-warmed surface. This was his favorite spot, he said, his voice full of a quiet reverence. Buster's place. We would come up here every morning. He would sit right here on this rock and watch the boats. He knew every one of them. He could tell which ones were coming in and which ones were going out. He was the real keeper of the light, you know. He smiled, a small, sad smile. He loved it up here. He loved the wind. He loved the sun. He could see the whole world from here. Phoebe looked around. She could feel it. She could feel the peace of this place. It was a place of quiet contemplation, a place to watch and to wait. She could picture him so clearly, the old one-eyed dog she had known, sitting here as a young, strong dog, his ears flapping in the wind, his intelligent eyes scanning the horizon. This was the heart of his story. This was the place he had been a king. They stood there for a long time, side by side, looking out at the sea. The shared silence was not empty. It was full of memories, full of stories, full of the powerful, unspoken presence of the friend they had both lost, and now had found again together. "It's time," Arthur said finally, his voice soft. He had carried the wooden box with him, holding it carefully in both hands. Now he held it out to Phoebe. "Will you do it?" he asked. "You brought him home. It's only right that you're the one to let him go." Phoebe's hands trembled slightly as she took the box. It felt warm from his hands. It was an incredible act of trust, of shared ownership of this final sacred moment. She looked at him, and he gave her a small, encouraging nod. She walked to the very edge of the cliff. The drop was sheer, down to the dark rocks and the swirling, white-foamed water below. The wind was gentle here, a soft, steady updraft that seemed to be lifting from the sea toward the sky. She sat down on the soft grass, crossing her legs, and placed the box in her lap. The lid was not nailed down. It was a simple, fitted lid. She took a deep breath, her heart full of a quiet, solemn love. She lifted the lid. Inside, the ashes were a soft, uniform gray, like the color of the sea on a cloudy day. They looked peaceful. They looked like they were sleeping. Arthur came and knelt beside her. He did not say anything. He just placed his large, weathered hand gently on her shoulder. His touch was a comfort, a quiet statement of their shared purpose. Phoebe tilted the box. The ashes began to flow out, a soft gray stream caught by the wind. They did not fall down to the rocks below. The updraft from the cliff face caught them, lifted them. They swirled and danced in the clear morning air, rising up, up, up. they became a soft gray cloud, a shimmering mist against the brilliant blue of the sky. The sunlight caught the tiny particles, making them sparkle like a cloud of tiny, brilliant diamonds. They floated there for a moment, a beautiful, ephemeral shape, a final, ghostly image of the friend they were setting free. Then, the wind carried them away, out over the vast blue expanse of the ocean, toward the horizon, toward the place where the sea meets the sky. They watched until the very last speck had disappeared, until there was nothing left but the clear air and the brilliant sun and the endless blue. It was over. He was free. He was home. A single tear rolled down Phoebe's cheek, but it was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of peace, a tear of completion, a tear of love. They did not leave right away. They sat there on the cliff's edge for a long time, the empty wooden box between them. A great sense of peace had settled over them. It was the quiet, clean peace that comes after a long and difficult journey is finally over. Arthur began to talk. He did not talk about the sadness, about the loss. He told her the funny stories. He told her about the time Buster had stolen a whole string of sausages from the kitchen of the Port Blossom General Store. He told her about the time Buster had tried to make friends with a grumpy old seal that liked to sunbathe on the rocks below the lighthouse. He told her about the silly, happy, ordinary moments that had made up their life together. His voice was full of a gentle, loving warmth. As he spoke, he was not just remembering his friend. He was bringing him back to life, right there on that sunny cliff top. He was painting a picture for Phoebe, filling in all the details of the life she had only been able to imagine. And as she listened, Phoebe found herself smiling and then laughing. The sound of her own laughter, light and free in the clean sea air, surprised her. It felt good. It felt right. This was not a sad ending. It was a celebration of a life well lived, a life of joy and loyalty and heroism. She stayed at the lighthouse for the rest of the day. It was a day outside of time, a quiet, peaceful pause between the end of one journey and the beginning of another. She helped Arthur with his chores. She helped him polish the huge, magnificent lens of the lighthouse lamp, its thick glass cool and smooth under her hands. She helped him chop firewood, the clean, sharp smell of the pine filling the air. She helped him make a simple lunch of soup and bread, which they ate outside, sitting on the stone step of the cottage, warmed by the afternoon sun. She listened to his stories. He told her about his life as a keeper, about the lonely nights and the wild storms, about the beauty and the danger of the sea. He told her about the town of Port Blossom, about the hardy, reserved people who lived there. He painted a picture of a life of solitude, but also a life of deep purpose and quiet dignity. And as she listened, she learned. She learned about a different way of being in the world, a way that was slower, quieter, more connected to the rhythms of the natural world. In turn, she told him a little about her own life, about the shelter, about the constant noise and the fleeting hope, about her feeling of being small and invisible. It was easy to talk to him. He was a good listener. He did not offer advice. He just listened with a quiet, steady attention that made her feel seen, made her feel understood. By the end of the day, she no longer felt like a stranger. She felt like a friend, The sun began to set, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and pink. It was time for her to go. The thought of leaving brought a pang of sadness. This lonely point of land had become a place of profound peace and connection for her. She did not want to leave it. Arthur walked her to her car. The goodbye was not emotional. It was quiet and simple, like everything else about their friendship. "Thank you," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "Thank you for bringing my boy home." "Thank you for sharing him with me," she said. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out. It was the small, tarnished metal tag from Buster's collar. He pressed it into her hand. "You should keep this," he said. "It belongs to you now. You're part of his story." Phoebe closed her hand around the small piece of metal. It was warm from his touch. It was no longer a clue to a mystery. It was a medal, a badge of honor, a symbol of a promise kept. She got into her car. She looked at the old man standing there, his white beard glowing in the soft light of the setting sun, the tall white lighthouse standing behind him like a faithful guardian. He was no longer just Arthur, the gruff, lonely keeper. He was a friend. She started the car and drove away, back down the narrow road along the cliffs. This time she looked in her rearview mirror. She watched until the lighthouse was just a tiny white speck against the darkening sky. Then it was gone. But she knew she would carry it with her, a beacon of light in her own heart, forever. The drive home was different from the journey out. The world did not seem so big and empty anymore. It seemed full of possibilities, full of quiet beauty, full of the potential for kindness in unexpected places. She was not the same person who had left Oak Creek a week ago. That girl had been timid, uncertain, a quiet observer of her own life. This new Phoebe, the one who was driving home, was different. She was calm. She was confident. She had a quiet strength she had never known she possessed. She had faced down her fears. She had navigated a long and difficult road, and she had brought a hero's story back into the light. She had found her own voice, not a loud one, but a steady, quiet one that was all her own. She arrived back at the Oak Creek Animal Shelter a week after she had left. The place was just the same loud chorus of barks and meows, the same sharp smell of bleach, the same feeling of desperate, hopeful waiting. But she was different. And because she was different, she saw the place with new eyes. She did not just see the sadness and the noise. She saw the stories. She saw that every animal in every cage had a past, a history, a life that was rich and complex and deserving of honor. She walked into Maria's office. Maria looked up from her paperwork, her face tired but her eyes sharp. "You're back," she said. It was not a question. "I'm back," Phoebe said, and her voice was clear and steady. She did not tell Maria the whole long, incredible story. She knew Maria would not understand all of it. Instead, she placed a piece of paper on the desk. It was a detailed, carefully thought-out proposal. At the top of the page, she had written a title: "The Senior Companions." Maria picked up the paper and began to read. Phoebe had used the long hours of the drive home to think. She had thought about Gus, alone in his kennel. She had thought about Arthur, alone in his cottage, and she had realized that their two lonelinesses could have been a comfort to each other. Her proposal was a plan for a new program at the shelter, a program dedicated to pairing elderly animals with elderly people in the community. It was a program about companionship, about making sure that no one, human or animal, had to be lonely in their final years. It was a program about honoring the quiet dignity of a long life. Maria read the entire proposal, her expression unreadable. When she was finished, she put the paper down and looked at Phoebe. She looked at her for a long, long time. She saw the change in her. She saw the new quiet confidence in her eyes. She saw the strength that had been forged on a long, improbable journey. A slow smile spread across Maria's tired face. "This is a wonderful idea, Phoebe," she said, her voice full of a genuine warmth and respect that Phoebe had never heard from her before. "A truly wonderful idea. Let's get to work." Phoebe walked out of the office and back into the noisy kennel room. She walked past the rows of cages, her heart full. She had not just come home, she had found her purpose. She had found her own way to be a keeper of the light, to make sure that no story, no matter how small or how quiet, was ever truly forgotten.